In a beautiful medieval house, the wind sways the curtains of a window. Inside, in one of the rooms, our protagonist wakes up with the sunlight shining on his face. As he opens his eyes, he seems a bit confused by the whole situation. Looking outside, the young man sees a huge and beautiful castle in his view. And completely shocked, he realizes he is inside the game he had been playing. Our future protagonist explains that 3 years ago, he possessed a character from a game, and the name of the game was The Heroic Legend of Arhan. The game was about various dangerous events that took place at an academy, and that resulted in endless incidents. But in the end, even the end of the world was addressed by the game, and the story was on a massive scale. And our protagonist thinks everything was fine because the protagonist of that story would take care of everything. He explains that he was just a background character anyway, named Corin Locke, and he was merely an NPC in a beginner's quest. Sometime later, we see Corin walking through the city greeting the NPCs and thinking that if the story follows the same path as the game, everything will be resolved. Then he decides he wants to take a look at the protagonist Park Seo, who would soon become rich and famous. He starts looking for the spawn point until he finds Park Seo talking about soda. Upon seeing that, he says in his head that soda didn't exist in that game and that guy wasn't normal. At that moment, Park puts his hand over his eye while stating that he would live for his own sake. Suddenly, Corin arrives and grabs Park's hand. Locke starts shouting that he was just like him, and in his mind, the boy explains that Park Seo was just an ordinary person who had also possessed a character from the game. Sometime later, we see Park defeating a huge dragon while Corin wonders if there was any difference between the two of them. It was that Park Seo had a privilege given to players, a status window. The problem was that Seo had never played that game before, but he could make up for it. So Locke approaches his companion, explaining to him how to manage his stats and informing him about things he would receive in the future. While talking about this, Corin states that he played through all the stories and all available routes of that game, and he was a professional in the heroic legend of Arhan. Confidently, the boy tells himself that having someone like him helping Park is an incredible advantage. However, a dog-like creature appears behind our protagonist and lunges to attack him. He and Park are simply surprised by it, but Seo doesn't waste time stepping in front of his friend and summoning a magic circle to slash the monster. With a friendly smile, he turns and asks if his companion is okay. While fighting creatures alongside his friend, Corin reports that he had all the information about the game, and Seo had the status window and the player's system. At that moment, we see our protagonist finishing off a demon with large horns. Future Corin comments that he and Park were a good duo, and with Seo, he believed they could save many people, prevent the end of the world, and return to Earth. On top of the pile of bodies next to his companion, Park hands him a potion, and Corin becomes curious about the origin of that potion. While drinking the liquid inside the bottle, he thinks that if there was one thing he was disappointed about, it was that his group only had males. And so we see that Park and Corin's group was made up entirely of men. In his head, the boy mentions that the charm of that game was that it had action and fantasy, and also a wide range of heroines and a dating simulation system. However, Park Seo didn't get involved with any women and only added them to the group when he thought it was necessary, and at a certain point, they ended up with an all-male group. So the young man asks his partner why their group only had a bunch of scruffy guys. Future Corin laments not having realized that earlier because he noticed that several things were different from the original story. Like when the grandmother of the Sword Emperor died on the way to the ceremony, or even when the final boss of the first stage, Marriott, disappeared. Moreover, mysterious murders and disappearances happened and the plot of the story began to deviate from the original game. And most importantly, what kept nagging at him was the way Park Seo thought, because his true personality was hidden and locked away tightly. Furious, our protagonist finishes by stating that he should have doubted his partner a little. One day, we see the boy completely shocked, staring at something. Corin explains that Marriott Dunalef is one of the heroines of the game, but neither he nor Seo had been able to find her because she disappeared. However, the girl's staff was there. Locke states that he followed that damn Park because he kept sneaking out at night, but he could never have imagined a place like that existed underground. And that was basically Seo's inventory, and so we see various items scattered around the location. Our protagonist even finds the secret piece of Dachi, a katana, and seeing it, the boy remarks that that weapon also vanished when the other heroine Alicia disappeared. Not only that, but all the weapons and items around him belonged to characters who disappeared as the game progressed. But that wasn't the worst part. And in front of him, the boy sees something terrifying. Locke comes across the body of a girl unconscious inside a huge container filled with a strange liquid. Immediately, Corin realizes that it was Marriott Dunalef. At that moment, Park Seo arrives at the scene, lamenting the situation. With a furious expression, he asks his partner why he was there. Corin corners him, asking what the hell all of that was and stating that Seo had said he went after Marriott but lost her. However, the boy only responds that Marriott was a demon, and he couldn't waste the blood of an ancient class vampire. And with a terrifying expression, the boy says he was just using her efficiently. Furthermore, he reminds Corin that he had also drunk plenty of that liquid. At that moment, a memory comes to his mind, and the boy remembers the potion he had received from his companion. Upon hearing that, he feels extremely nauseous and wants to vomit. Park asks his partner what the problem was, saying that he had worked hard to capture her and had spent a month setting a trap in the forest. Shocked and furious at the situation, Corin asks why he was doing all of this. With a cold expression, Sue simply responds that it was to progress the story efficiently, since the route Corin wanted to follow was frustrating. He corners Locke while saying the boy always ended up at a loss because he saved people and didn't kill irritating bastards like Jaeger and Lark. And he insisted on trying to save people he couldn't manipulate, and using them that way was more effective, and Sue claims he was better at the game than Corin. Our protagonist thinks that Bastard lied to him from the beginning, and that he wasn't a newbie to the game. Locke asks his ex-partner how many people he has killed, and the young man appears thoughtful. With a horrifying expression, he states that if he gets 3 more kills, he'll reach 100,000 on his count. Upon hearing that, Corin thinks that he isn't human and hatred takes over his body. He grabs Park by the collar, calling him a monster, but Sue just retorts that those people are all NPCs, and that Corin had killed some of them too. But the boy yells that the ones he killed were evil people beyond salvation, and they were even trying to destroy the world. Hearing that nonsense from Park, Corin states that if he was so obsessed with efficiency, he shouldn't have taken the Odachi, since a mage shouldn't pick a weapon meant only for a knight, and he also questions why the boy didn't use regular elixirs instead of using people. Commenting that he could easily make an elixir through his status window, Locke even questions why the boy did all that senseless crap. Tired of it all, Corin states that Sue just needed a punching bag for his sociopathic tendencies and had no real reason. But after hearing that, Park grabs the back of our protagonist's neck. He throws the boy backward, making him hit his head against the glass containing Marriott. Corin becomes completely injured and falls to the ground right after. Sue says that after everything he did for his companion, he shouldn't be talking like that, because in the end he was only thinking about Corin when he did those things, and he should be everything to the boy. And with a malevolent expression, he starts speaking to our protagonist like a jealous and toxic girlfriend. Upon hearing that, Corin becomes confused, asking what the hell the guy was saying. He steps back, commenting that Park wasn't that kind of character, and they've been together for many chapters and shouldn't change the genre of the story out of nowhere. Walking toward his love, Sue says he removed everything that could get in his way up until now, and Corin realizes that was the reason there were only men in the group. Sue reveals that the other men were just for him to look at, and the only one he truly loved was Corin. Desperate, the boy punches his ex-partner and while running away, says that guy was way too creepy, and he was scared. Suddenly, some purple tentacles emerge, grabbing his foot. Corin is covered by those weird tentacles that make him completely uncomfortable. They squeeze him, forcing the boy to kneel while Corin begins to cry in despair. Park declares that his love couldn't run from him and he would imprison the boy forever because he belonged to him. The lunatic even comments that in that fake world, Corin was the only real thing. And hearing that talk, Locke replies that his companion was scaring him. However, while being surrounded by a dark aura, Sue states that everything would end soon, and once that battle was over, he and Corin would be together forever, and then Locke's world goes black. Our protagonist is sent to another place, and a system notification appears saying that the final stage of the game has begun. While reflecting on his life, he thinks that Sue always killed everything alone, so he is sure the boy will defeat the final boss too. And when that happened, he'd be doomed. However, a system window appears saying that the player died and the challenge failed, leaving Corin confused. We then return to the scene from the first chapter, where our protagonist woke up for the first time in that world. The boy was panting, questioning what the hell was happening. He gets up, worried and not understanding anything. Once again looking toward the horizon, the boy thinks he had returned to 3 years ago, the day he first arrived there. Clenching his fists, the boy bites his lips and states that he had to kill Park Sihu. And for the first time, he was going to truly kill someone, a player. Court explains that during the aquatic monster conquest mission, the dam burst, sweeping away an entire village from the map. Thousands of aquatic monsters and people drowned. And in front of that horrifying scene, Park Sihu laughed maniacally. Locke reports that at that time, he simply couldn't understand why he was laughing so much. But thinking about it now, although countless people had died, Park was only thinking about the XP he had gained from that event. Then, remembering Sue saying he was close to 100,000 kills, our protagonist calls the boy a demon. While running in one direction, the boy thinks that by having gone back in time, he could stop him now. Corin thinks that at this point, Park Sihu was only at rank 5, just like him. Besides, all the player's strengthening factors are concentrated in the Merkaba Academy, and after entering there, he became much stronger. That is, he's not a monster yet, but there's no way to know how strong he'll become after enrolling in the academy, and the entrance ceremony would happen in 5 days. Thus, we see our protagonist collecting some golden mushrooms, without knowing what he'll use them for. And the boy concludes by saying that, in other words, the only chance to kill Park Sihu was now. In the middle of a forest, surrounded by mountains, a tutorial mission appears for Park Sihu to protect a carriage. We see 2 guards finishing off a magical monster, and the girl praises Park. The young man playing dumb simply thanks her. Suddenly, the man driving the carriage calls the 2 guards, saying it had been repaired. Leon celebrates, saying they can finally leave, and Laura replies that she wants to sleep as soon as possible. However, a thunderous sound can be heard nearby. Suddenly, a wooden log flies toward the 2 soldiers. Liam pushes his partner aside, preventing her from being hit, and then he narrowly dodges it himself, almost dying in the process. Immediately, the guard regains composure and asks Laura to do the same. Looking ahead, the 2 of them see a monstrous werewolf. The creature, while making some crying sounds, howls toward the sky. Loft was watching the whole scene from the bushes, and he realizes it had already started, and even though he had rushed there, he couldn't stop it. The young man comments that if he had more time to prepare, he could have saved those people too. And at that moment, the werewolf strikes Laura, slashing her chest. Immediately, Leon panics, shouting for his partner, who falls to the ground beside him. Desperate, the soldier yells for Park to get into the carriage while he buys them time. However, Sue orders the man beside him to get into the carriage to protect the girl inside as he would fight. The girl shouts for Park not to abandon them and run. But at that moment, Sue looks ahead and sees that the werewolf has defeated Leon and is holding him by the neck. The black-haired boy is in shock, not knowing how to react. Seeing this scene, our protagonist thinks that before interfering, he needs to confirm whether Park Sihu is the hero who will save that world, or if he is a player who possessed a game character's body just like him. Park, even though afraid in front of that beast, seems confident. The werewolf once again lets out a beastly roar. The girl who was in the carriage appears wielding a sword and asking Park to duck. She then strikes the creature in front of her, but the monster defends itself. The young woman is shocked that the monster stopped her blow so easily. She is then thrown slightly backward, getting closer to Park. Sihu, seeing the girl who protected him in front of him, seems to think of something. We see that she is the second daughter of the Arden family, who possesses the Odachi, one of the king's 6 swords, and a named character, Alicia Arden. Watching this scene, our protagonist states that even in the tutorial, there was a surprise. And at that moment, Park draws a blade with a purple aura, and finally Locke concludes that the Easter egg was that Alicia dies. So Park stabs the girl in the back, revealing himself to be the same sociopath as in the previous life. Corin immediately realizes that he really hadn't changed. The girl, who was grazed by the blow, is frightened and wonders why that boy was doing this. Park, being the sociopath he is, apologizes, saying his hand slipped and he couldn't finish the girl off easily. Once again, the werewolf howls at the moon. The creature charges at Alicia. Seeing this, Locke thinks that if she dies there, Park will get his hands on the Odachi. After that, he'll be able to join Lunia Arden's group, a great swordsman, and Park realizes that even though Alicia is poisoned, she won't die easily. Alicia immediately distances herself from the werewolf, moving to the back. Surrounded by a blue energy, she tries to calm herself even in that situation. While breathing, the young woman tries to maintain focus until she finally opens her eyes. Corin, watching that, realizes that this was the perfect footwork of Alicia Arden, and the girl assumes a battle stance. The werewolf charges again, but this time Alicia is ready, with an aura surrounding her sword. Sue thinks that at this rate, she might end up killing the werewolf. So he concludes that he won't let that happen and prepares to throw his knife. The boy quickly throws his weapon in Alicia's direction, and she notices the movement. She manages to deflect the object, becoming even more irritated. However, when she turns her gaze back to her enemy in front of her, she realizes he is already too close. The young woman even manages to stab the werewolf with her sword, but it's already too late, and it counterattacks, biting her. The lifeless body of the werewolf falls on top of the wounded Alicia. Park approaches her, and seeing this, the young woman asks why the hell he is doing this. Wielding the Odachi, Sue starts smiling with joy. He thinks that that equipment can only be used with a special skill, but he'll learn it later. And as he looks back at Alicia, he questions whether killing NPCs really grants EXP. Like a psychopath, the boy begins to move toward Alicia, who still had the werewolf's mouth stuck in her stomach. The girl, looking at Suhu, sees a terrifying expression on that bastard's face. However, suddenly, a bag with a mysterious powder hits Park's head. The powder spreads, making the boy cough and his vision blur. Looking at it, he asks what the hell hit him. Desperate, Park demands that whoever did that appear immediately. But suddenly, several horned rabbits begin heading toward the boy. Corin explains that magic mushrooms are forest monsters' favorites and are covered in white powder. So in the eyes of the forest monsters, Park Sihu is nothing but fresh meat. The protagonist of that story tries to defend himself from the creatures. While his opponent is busy, Corin tries to get Alicia out of there, realizing that the girl is alive. Looking at the werewolf in front of him, he notices a sharp fang in its mouth. Immediately, he moves to remove it for later use. But the boy feels a terrifying aura beside him. Park, wielding the Odachi, asks who the hell the boy in front of him is. Thinking that his enemy eliminated 3 horned rats in a minute, Corin asks Park if he liked the sword. Seeing that, Sue appears confused, looking at the person in front of him, and he recognizes that this was the appearance of the NPC Corin Locke. Park then asks what the hell Corin is doing there, and our protagonist realizes that Bastard had lost his previous memories. In his head, he says that this is great and warns Park that he's going to end up cutting his hand holding the sword like that. The confused boy looks to see what he's doing wrong, but the protagonist sees it as the perfect opportunity. He grabs some sand from the ground and throws it in Park's face. The boy's vision is completely distorted. In desperation, Park begins swinging at everything in front of him, and Corin thinks that even though Park is clumsy with a sword, he's fast. Besides that, Sigu is much stronger than him physically, and his only option is to be smart. So with the wolf fang in his hand, he tries to strike Park, who regains his vision and barely dodges. Still trying to hit his enemy multiple times, our protagonist seems very determined. As he launches the attacks, he prays in his head that Park focuses only on the fang he's holding, until the boy sees nothing but that. Thus, Corin distracts Park and begins making a movement with his other hand. Stu is completely lost, not knowing how to react. Our protagonist reveals that he's wielding a dagger in his other hand. He manages to knock his enemy down and stabs him right after. The bastard Park starts screaming in pain from the wound. With the wolf fang still in his other hand, Korin prepares for another attack. He aims at Park's neck, who panics upon seeing it. Park instinctively raises his hand to block the attack and gets it pierced. But our protagonist is determined and doesn't stop, starting to push his attack toward his enemy's neck. Park can't hold him back and gets his neck stabbed, being finished off by that blow. Looking at the body of his former friend, Korin gives thanks for his past life and says he has to admit that thanks to Park, he became stronger. Even so, he has no regrets about it, because he cut evil at the root and finished off someone who deserved it. The system begins to glitch upon detecting that the main player was killed. It then calculates the probabilities of completing the main scenario, and with the best backup recommendation in the world, it selects the variant Korin lock. Thus, the system transfers Park's points to Korin and more information appears. The system initiates the subsection of subplayer Korin Locke, who is now an AA rank knight and successor to the martial master. Our protagonist gains some muscle and realizes he has become a subplayer, and that means he will finally have a status window. However, something comes to his mind and he looks back. The young man sees Alicia completely wounded and almost lifeless. He goes to the girl, asking if she's okay, and using what little strength she has left, she speaks with Korin. Locke asks the girl if she's dizzy and can't smell anything, and the young woman replies yes. With a few more questions, he discovers what poison is inside Alicia. He also notes that at this point in the tutorial, that poison is difficult to create, and if Park had made it using the combination window, Alicia would already be dead. But since that didn't happen, it's a relief, and because there's still a fang stuck in Alicia's body, she's in danger, and he needs to stop the bleeding and detoxify her. So the boy takes off his belt and ties it around the girl's body to make a tourniquet, telling her that everything will be fine. In his mind, the boy thinks that if she bites her tongue, it would be a big problem, and he needs to find something for her to bite. Then our protagonist looks at Parker's arm. Even reluctant about it, he sees no other choice. So the boy puts Sue's arm in Alicia's mouth, asking the girl to bite it. While taking off his shirt, he tells her that it's going to hurt a lot and she needs to hold on until the end. In his mind, the boy reports that he doesn't know why he traveled 3 years back in time, but he returned and killed a player. And the person who died in his past life is alive now, and at that moment, the boy pulls the fang from Alicia's body. After doing that, the girl tries to scream in pain, but can't because of the arm in her mouth. She immediately faints, unable to endure, and Korin thinks that that was enough. Sometime later, we see a pot cooking something over a campfire. Korin tells Alicia, who had just woken up, that he's making the antidote for her. The young man also asks the girl not to worry since she won't die so easily. In her daze, the girl asks Korin to tell her his name, but he replies that she doesn't need to know it. He also tells the girl to stop thinking about it and get some rest, and Locke thinks that from now on, he should keep people in the dark about his actions. Next, he begins to clarify the situation, thinking that the story of the game, the heroic legend of Arhan, as the name suggests, is the story of a hero. While solving the incidents that occur at the academy, the player becomes the hero who will save the world. In addition, the hero must defeat countless villains and the final boss. And the only reason Park followed the story was because the world would end if the final boss wasn't defeated. However, that player had now died, so someone had to fill that role. That's why he states that it should be him, the sub-player. Seeing that he was being forced into that role, he thinks that at the very least, the people who control the system should help him. At that moment, we see that the young man had several restrictions with the current status window. He thinks that he became a sub-player but couldn't use any of the convenient tools that players use, and he got excited for nothing. The boy also says it's very hard to be the backup for something you don't understand, relying only on future memories, so he'll use external factors outside the system. Korin remembers that for 3 years he trained to his limit and he was no longer a mere possessor or a background character. While drawing a circle on the ground, something begins to glow inside the drawing. An energy resembling a flame emerges from the magic circle, rising to the sky. Seeing this, Locke thinks that, just as he thought, it actually worked, and he says he was desperate to survive. The boy explains that the only magic he learned in his previous life was the runes, which were ancestral letters that held magical power by themselves. He also remembers that there were the 3 commandment runes, duty, restriction, and oath, and they were some of the most powerful laws in that world, the source of superhuman strength and the cause of destruction. That's why the boy says he will write all 3 on his body. As he begins to draw a symbol with his own blood on his body, he says the first was duty, and then some letters appear on his arm. The young man explains that that commandment grants extra power to the caster when they honor a self-imposed oath like not eating chicken. But since they're very easy to adopt, you barely gain status through them because it works like a scale. He says that although it's hard, he will make difficult promises that he'll fulfill to the end, and he decides that his duty will be that he won't close his eyes to the misfortunes of good people. The system accepts it and wraps the boy's heart in a small chain, stating that failing to fulfill it will result in a penalty. Locke continues, saying the second was restriction, and the one he would choose was the inability to perceive spirits. The boy explains that in that world, all things emit spiritual perception, and astral beings like ghosts and spirits, who have no material body, exist. However, since ancestral beings only get involved after mutual recognition, they can't use any of their powers on people unaware of their existence. The system applies the conditions of the oath. Korin thinks that the penalty of ancestral beings not being able to affect him has become a shield that protects him from all ancestral entities in the world. And now the last rune he will use is the oath, and that commandment, when used, carries great risk. That's why neither he nor Park used it in their past life. But even Park Sihu, who used everything the system offered, still failed in the end against the final boss. So he concludes that in this case, there's no reason to worry, and he declares that the oath he will make is that he will save that world. The boy says that this is an oath that literally seeks the greatest of a warrior's ambitions. His heart is wrapped in chains, and the commandments are completed. The boy's body begins to be overtaken by several letters, and the system informs that failure to fulfill the oath will result in inevitable death. The next day, Alicia wakes up in a bed. The young woman gets up, confused and still in some pain from her wounds. The nurse appears beside the girl and explains that she is in the emergency hospital in the city of Merkaba. Alicia asks where the person who brought her there is, and the nurse simply responds that her guardian just left her there and went away, which leaves the girl confused. The woman tries to tell the girl not to move, but Alicia is determined and asks where her belongings are. Looking in her bag beside her, she notices that inside was the belt of the person who had saved her. She also notices that there was still blood on the object. Arden promptly screams, calling the nurse, who quickly answers the call. Then Alicia asks the woman if there was any place there that sold honey candies, but the pink-haired girl tries to explain that she can only eat soup for now. We then skip to 3 days after the tutorial mission, on the day of the Merkaba Academy entrance ceremony. While searching through his wallet for his student ID, Korin finds something strange. He notices that inside there is a letter, and the boy says he doesn't remember putting that there. The young man begins to read the letter left by his father, in which the man says he's very proud of his son and asks the boy to become someone who protects the weak. Our protagonist wonders when his father placed that there and explains that Korin Locke in the game is just a normal and incompetent child. But even he has a family, and when he took over that body, he acted awkwardly. But even so, they still treated him like part of the family. And that was how he learned to love them, and in fact, his family and that world were what made him different from Park Siu. Several carriages stop beneath a structure. Several young soldiers step down from the carriages, stopping in front of Merkaba Academy. A blue-haired girl welcomes the new students and asks them to gather near her. The girl is impressed by Korin Locke's size and asks if he's a student too, and Korin replies that yes, he is. Then, in a charismatic way, she asks if the boy wants a potato. We see that the carriages were a kind of technological vehicle. Marriott begins explaining to the students some facts about the academy, and Korin, looking at the girl, explains that she's a second-year student. A mage from Merkaba Academy who receives everyone's blessing. However, Korin states that as time passes, people in that world experience unpredictable tragedies. And there are depths of despair that will happen to Marriott in the future, and because of that, she would become the boss of the first act. The vehicle carrying the new students to the academy stops, and Marriott asks them to step down carefully and take a sweet potato. Then the girl bids farewell to the youths, wishing them good luck. It's clear that the interior of Merkaba Academy is huge and quite fancy. Looking at a magic circle above his head, our protagonist thinks that the magic expansion spell is beginning. Suddenly, all the students are in darkness and panic spreads through the place. A mysterious voice tells the students not to be nervous and starts mocking them for being scared by just that. Calmly, Korin thinks that this is the voice of old Hammond, and his pattern is always the same. He explains that the inhabitants of that world have a history of battles against the evil tribe, and the most effective weapon against them were superhumans capable of using mana. And the place that developed those superhumans was Merkaba Academy, and at that moment, a silhouette appears in the darkness greeting the new cadets. Fermac Damon introduces himself to the students, saying that he is responsible for that year's welcome ceremony. Korin, while listening to the boy's speech, thinks that it's been a while since he last saw him, and Fermac comments that the students came there to become knights or mages. But it was annoying how they acted like they were amazing when they were probably a bunch of nobodies, and that's why he wanted to test the cadets' abilities. Suddenly, a holographic screen appears in front of all the students. We see that it displays information about aura ranking, mana, skills, and the person's overall ranking. Lox, seeing that, thinks it's very boring and says that his physical attributes are horrendous. Fermac informs them that what they're seeing now is the overall ranking itself, and he asks everyone to stand in front of the plaque with their name. Our protagonist and the people with number 6 do so, and Korin thinks that there were 400 students, and he was in the bottom 1%. With a frightening expression, Fermac wishes the students good luck in the battle. The golden aura suddenly covers all the cadets. As the students are transported to another location, one of the teachers comments that this year there are many rough diamonds among the students. A blonde-haired woman states that they didn't need to evaluate the first and second-ranked students and should focus only on the others. We are introduced to the rank 2 students, Alicia the Druid, Ewell the sword-wielding mercenary, Dron Worski, and the Golem sorcerer Kranaludin. And there was only one rank 1 woman, dressed in a nun's outfit. She was the celestial Yaksha, and her name was Horan. The blonde teacher is surprised that that woman enrolled in the academy and questions what the director was thinking. A white-haired man beside her comments that they didn't need to test the rank 6 students, since even the rank 5 ones didn't seem promising and should just be discarded. However, the blonde replies that the director said all students must walk the path of learning, and angrily she intimidates her colleague. The white-haired man then decides they should just begin already. In a completely dark area, a box falls in front of our protagonist, and the teachers announce that in seconds a swarm of monsters will be released. Korin thinks this is a test that puts you in a place with nothing and makes you fight monsters based on your level, and it's really unfriendly. He opens the weapon box in front of him and begins searching through it. The young man thinks that most rank 5 and 6 students probably won't even have time to think and will just grab anything, and that's what he did last time. Magical monsters begin to appear in front of him. The small dogs get ready and begin growling our protagonist. Lox draws a weapon while saying that swords are cool, but they say it takes 100 days to use a spear, 1,000 days for a blade, and 10,000 days for a sword. So the answer was obvious, and he chose the spear. At that moment, he throws the weapon at one of the dogs. The monster is instantly hit and erased from the face of the earth. Korin raises his hand in the air while mocking the beasts. The other 2 dogs try to run but are immediately struck by Korin's spear. Watching this, he says he has too much experience killing those animals. After eliminating one more of the dogs, the protagonist thinks he has already wasted too much time. He states that in his past life, he couldn't even kill those small dogs and was eliminated, but this time was different, and he would kill all of them until the next rank. And at that moment, the young man declares that the next horde of monsters could come. Korin thinks that 5 minutes have passed, but suddenly the boy notices something strange and becomes confused. Locke realizes that no new monsters are coming and wonders if the system is broken. The white-haired professor from earlier, seeing the rank 5 students being defeated, thinks they're failures for not even being able to kill those weak animals. Moreover, the man even thinks that if the rank 5 students are like that, there's no point in even looking at the rank 6 until he approaches a crystal ball. He sees our protagonist calmly resting and wonders if the monsters weren't summoned. The man says it must be some bug and summons the dogs again, and Korin becomes confused since the same monsters as before returned. Once again, the professor walks away calmly as Korin resumes dealing with his enemies. The man notes that one student passed the test in 7 minutes and 20 seconds. He guesses that the rank 3 students will probably only need 2 or 3 minutes and once again questions what the rank 5 and 6 students were doing. Again, he sees Locke calmly lying down and wonders why the hell the boy is like that again and if there was a summoning error. Another teacher replies that it's impossible since Madame Josephine's test has never failed, and the other smugly retorts that Korin shouldn't have already been eliminated. The man asks if his friend had seen the monsters fail to be summoned, but the other replies that there was no need for that. Once more, they decide to summon the dogs, and seeing this, Korin questions why they keep sending the same dogs. Furious once again, he prepares to launch 3 spears at the animals. In the blink of an eye, the 3 dogs are obliterated in just 7.3 seconds. The 2 professors from before are completely astonished, questioning what the hell that was. They promptly call Professor Fermac to have a look at it. The grumpy one from earlier asks what the record was for the 3rd and 4th ranked students, and Fermac replies that there was a boy named Jager who did it in 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Fermac asks why the question, and upon hearing that, the white-haired professor responds that it was nothing special. Stating how good Korin was at throwing, he assumes the boy is the son of a hunter, so he summons a level 4 monster, a boar, to see how the boy performs. However, in just 3.7 seconds, the boar is obliterated by our protagonist. Furious at this, the professor decides to go all out and summons a rank 3 owlbear. The creature promptly tries to claw at Korin, who dodges to the side. Next, the boy uses his spear to pierce the creature, but it's not enough, and the owlbear once again launches an attack at Locke, who moves to the side. The boy uses a rune and a flame appears on his spear. With that, he manages to set the owlbear on fire, which begins to scream in pain. The other professors, upon seeing this, question how the hell that boy had a magic rune. Fermac is completely confused by this. However, the magical beast reveals that it hasn't been finished off yet and once again tries to strike Korin, who easily dodges. He realizes that it didn't seem very effective, but it was enough to block the beast's vision, and then he charges at the creature. Locke spins his spear skillfully, leaping over the monster's head, landing and piercing it. The old professor from before thinks that the boy certainly wasn't just a mere rank 6, and it was a shame that the tests only summoned monsters up to rank 3. He's surprised that an interesting kid showed up for the first time in a while and is excited to see the boy fight against evil spirits. The professors decide to begin the rank -5 evil spirit test, and the creature is summoned in front of Korin. Korin thinks he feels something being summoned, but he couldn't see or hear it due to the restriction penalty. He even reports that he couldn't feel or interact with ghosts, souls, or spirits, and since that was the case, it meant he couldn't engage with evil spirits. For some reason, the boy begins counting, finishing the count at the number 60. Locke states that it was done and that something was definitely activated, and since he had confirmed everything he needed, he would now end it. So the boy decides to give up, and for some reason, Korin raises his hand, withdrawing from the test. Korin is disqualified from the 3 tests involving ghosts, but manages to break all 3 records for the monster tests. The white-haired professor from before questions why the hell Korin had given up, and confused, he wonders who that boy was. Sometime later, we see several warriors gathered in the hall. People were talking about what ranking they had achieved. In the middle of the room, a flashy blonde named Jager Hinchpitter seemed quite excited. Upon seeing him, Korin thinks that this was the guy who started a fight with Park Siu at the beginning of the story in his past life, and in fact, Park Siu had killed him because he got irritated. The boy also thinks that although Jager is an arrogant delinquent, that's common at his age and Park had gone too far. Amid the crowd of young people, a black-haired boy seemed nervous. Locke explains that this boy was Lark, and in his past life, he couldn't overcome his inferiority complex and started spreading lies about Park and Korin. Because of that, Lark ended up meeting the same fate as Jager, and suddenly a voice is heard, and someone starts speaking near the microphone. It's revealed that this person is Director Ari of Kaysar, and after introducing himself, the man says that to become stronger, they had entered the academy where the strongest gather. The man continues his speech saying that some have enough, while others have a long way to go. And although he cannot guarantee the boys will get what they want by the end of their time there, he hopes they will all be able to find their own paths, because they were there only to help them take the first step correctly, since from the second one on it would be their responsibility, and that was all. All the cadets disperse and begin moving throughout the academy. While bragging about his strength, Jaeger ends up noticing Lark. The blonde approaches the boy and asks him what his rank was, and the boy replies that Lark was rank 5. The arrogant one starts mocking the bull-headed boy, who becomes intimidated. Corin appears behind the blonde, trying to calm the situation. Locke starts complimenting one of Jaeger's tattoos, showing a lot of interest in it. Jaeger ends up getting very smug, stating that Corin knew what was up and explaining that, to be honest, it was his mother who made that tattoo. Corin shows interest in the subject and asks Jaeger if he had more tattoos while thinking that he already knew all of this. He explains that in his past life, when Jaeger disappeared, his mother came to the academy, saying that Jaeger's tattoo wasn't just for show, but something she made out of concern for her son, who had entered the Guardian Academy. Jaeger keeps showing off, very proud of all his tattoos, and Lark comments that they were really cool. The two boys introduce themselves and get to know each other, becoming pretty good friends. Locke brings Lark into the conversation and asks what his name was, and the young man introduces himself. Seeing that scene, Alicia looks very happy. The young woman comments that our protagonist saved his classmate who was being bullied very naturally, and that was amazing. And Corin actually seemed like a good person. Corin explains that this is how he made a good impression on Lark, and Locke remembers that the boy's skill was memorization. And with an evil smile, the young man says he found his free skill book. It's explained that most of the Merkaba Academy's facilities are provided free of charge. The academy provides a cafeteria with cheaper food, free dormitories, and most importantly, a training facility. Corin thinks that by using the training rooms, even impossible training becomes possible. For example, fighting spiritual bodies that were previously invisible to him, and thus we see the boy dueling with a kind of blue bird. Some students watch our protagonist, noticing that he was a freshman and wondering why a newbie was using a spiritual body for practice. They start doubting the boy and his abilities until Marriott arrives at the scene and watches. Locke is hit by a strike, and the students from before keep mocking the boy. The boy wonders if that beast was too much for him, until a professor approaches, noticing he was a freshman. The instructor asks Corin why he was fighting a spiritual body, and the young man replies that it was to train his spear skills. The professor asks if Corin was confident he could defeat that opponent, and the young man replies that he would find a way. In his head, he wonders why that old man approached him out of nowhere, and if he had done something wrong during the entrance exam. With an apparently irritated expression, the instructor looks thoughtful. However, he opens a huge smile, saying that Locke had great spirit, and gives him some meal vouchers. Before leaving, the man also asks Corin to look for him if he manages to defeat the spiritual body. Our protagonist is confused by the situation, but states that in the end, that was a good thing. He then decides to return to his fight, and Marriott continues watching the battle. The spiritual body and Corin exchange evenly match blows. Corin is hit by the creature's beak right in his ribs. With that hit, he is thrown backward, landing on his back on the ground. Locke sighs until a cloth falls on his face. Marriott, handing him a cup of water, asks the freshman if it was hard, and Corin replies yes. The young woman says he could rest now since he had worked hard enough. She also encourages the protagonist, saying he just needed to get the hang of it, and that he would manage to defeat that creature the next time he fought it. Hearing this, Corin thinks there wasn't a next time, although he might have had one 3 years ago. The young man remembers that at that time he had Park by his side, and the boy had the player's stats window as well as potions and skill books. However, Park wasn't there anymore because he killed him, so now he had to do everything on his own. Corin thanks Marriott, handing her the cup back and standing up. He thinks he must become as strong as possible and once again wields his spear. Locke decides that first he must discover his limits, so he will test how much he can use the skills he learned in the past. The young man shows some of them, like the serpent thrust, the tiger wind strike, and the counter from the capture plate block. And finally, he performs another of his skills called the returning sky spin. In his head, he comments that he didn't have a strong body, nor great magical power or aura, and that future knowledge was useless in the face of monsters or geniuses. However, to face monsters and geniuses, he had to work harder than anyone else, and that was the only identity he possessed. Thus, while a red aura surrounds him, the young man comments that his last 3 years will not betray him, and so he throws his spear in the direction of the creature. However, the spiritual body manages to dodge easily. Marriott thinks that our protagonist simply got rid of his own weapon and wonders if he gave up on the fight. But the weapon returns to Corin's hand, and she is left confused. The girl immediately realizes that he had not given up and had only made a strategy. With the spear back in his hand, our protagonist charges at the spiritual body, which was off guard. He uses one of his skills, piercing through the bird and finishing it off. With that strike, a huge blue explosion happens. The narrator reports that words of sincere appreciation lingered on Marie's tongue, and looking at our protagonist in the air, she says that the boy was truly amazing. However, after defeating the creature, Corin crashes to the ground and Marriott asks if he is okay. Exhausted, the boy thinks he was being too excessive at the end, and that his body couldn't handle much of his skills. The next day, we see the imposing and beautiful Merkaba Academy. Marriott tells the students that today she would show them the school facilities. While eating a piece of bread, Korin states that to fight properly, his body is the most urgent issue he needed to solve, and to increase his physical capabilities without relying on Park Soo's elixirs. There was only one way. That way was the commandments and looking at Lark. He thinks that he couldn't close his eyes to others' misfortune because that was what he had promised. The young man approaches Lark, greeting him. Korin, as cunning as ever, whispers in Lark's ear, asking if the boy didn't want to talk about grimoires. Lark explains that a grimoire is a skill book and a powerful artifact that allows one to acquire magic or a trait just by reading. Moreover, Merkaba Academy's library is enormous, storing and passing on the knowledge of humanity to future generations. However, all of that was nonsense, and in truth, that place existed to hide the grimoires. After all, it was very clever to hide a tree in a forest, and Lark, hearing that, just ignores it and asks Korin to keep his promise. Lark replies that as long as Lark fulfills the conditions, he will get the grimoire with the traits written on it. In his head, Korin thinks that Lark is a hard worker, an intellectual, a model student who memorized all kinds of magic and stored them in his spellbook. But no matter how many spells he had, using them all would be difficult, since if a mage's level and mana level are low, it can't produce good results. But with a grimoire, it's a different story, and we see our protagonist knocking over several books for some reason. Lark asks the boy to stop fooling around. However, at that moment, a hidden door opens in the library, leaving the bull-headed boy impressed. Korin heads toward the place, and Lark asks him to wait for him. The two walk down a huge and rather frightening corridor. Lark calls for Lark and says that this was the time for the boy to fulfill his promise, raising his hand to greet him. The bull-headed boy agrees, asking if our protagonist really wanted his help to repel the evil spirit. Confused, the bull-headed one asks what was needed, but at that moment, for some reason, Korin strikes Lark in the face. With a demonic expression, he states that they were about to begin. Our protagonist explains that although his initial reason for coming there was to help Lark, he also wanted to complete a special quest. And if he captured the evil spirits there, he could acquire the secret item he wanted. But there was a problem, and we see that behind him was a special evil spirit called Sabantia Duke. Korin explains that this mission was created to be impossible to complete, and he was not capable of capturing a special evil spirit with his current power level. Sabantia then summons several purple spheres around him and launches them at the boy in front of him. Locke states that the attack of a Duke general who has ruled the South for 800 years is powerful, and most players die as soon as the quest starts. But it was clear that he wasn't one of them, and in this way the boy manages to dodge Sabantia's strikes easily. We see that all of this was due to the restriction that prevented Korin from noticing spirits, and even with the Duke attacking him several times, nothing had any effect. However, Korin comments that the obvious problem was that he also couldn't see his enemy. Bluntly, Korin speaks to Duke Sabantia and apologizes for not being able to see him. He then asks if the evil spirit could enter that boy's body. Korin says that in this world, some people are born with a trait called a mark, which turns humans into demi-humans like vampires or werewolves. One day, Duke Sabantia awakened as a vampire and killed his own servant. Although he worked hard to control his instincts, he failed. In the end, afraid of killing his wife and daughter, he evacuated his family and sealed the castle. Furthermore, to avoid a massacre, the Duke used magic to seal himself inside a book, and that was the grimoire in this library. Then we see Sabantia possessing Lark's body. Using the boy's body, the monster charges at Korin. Locke explains that the second reason he chose Lark is because if he was possessed by the special evil spirit, he could use his physical abilities to the fullest. And in the heroic legend of Arhen, Lark had the lowest strength stat, and at that moment, Korin strikes the boy, slamming him to the ground. The boy steps on Lark's body while thinking he feels sorry for Bugman, but that was the best strategy to complete the Duke's mission. Moreover, if he killed the possessed boy and ended it, he could get the high-rank items like the Duke's cloak and the vampire armor. The young man also remembers that those were the items Park used and that they played a major role in the incidents that happened in the future. However, he says he's different from Park. So Korin asks Sabantia if he was curious about his wife Lumina Duke and his daughter Cecilia Duke, and what kind of life they lived after the young man was sealed away. Locke says he told many stories to Sabantia, like how his wife died after leaving the castle, and how his daughter became an incredible adventurer and traveled the world. He says he didn't like the method Park Sidu used, and that he wanted to be different, and then asks Sabantia if his story was satisfying. In his head, Korin also thinks that he wanted to give a proper end to that poor soul. Sabantia apologizes for attacking Korin and thanks him for the information. Our protagonist also says that before he ascended, they had a long conversation until the man finally found peace. We then see some items our protagonist had collected, among them the grimoire in which Sabantia's soul had been sealed. Locke uses the grimoire and acquires a new skill called Persistent Warrior's Regeneration. Upon seeing this, Korin thinks that was a skill Park also had in the past, but he doesn't know how much it regenerates since Park never actually got hurt. Lark begins to wake up, and Locke explains to him what had happened. Confused, the bull-headed boy asks if it was normal for his jaw to hurt when an evil spirit possesses you. Korin retorts that he doesn't know, but then tells him to shut up and hand over the grimoire he got. Our protagonist also thinks that the last reason he chose Lark is because he wanted to see how sometimes those who work hard can be rewarded. Due to the protagonist's rune, which wouldn't let him close his eyes to the misfortunes of good people, the boy receives 80 points. He says that based on the game, you gain 5 stat points when you level up, so that number equaled the amount you get from leveling up 16 times. The boy also thinks that since he didn't receive a level up notification, that means the first level quest reward is 80 points. We then see that he received those stat points because he didn't turn a blind eye to the misfortunes of Lark or of Sabantia Duke. In the Vigor training room, Marriott asks the people there if they wanted potatoes. Several students say yes, and the girl begins distributing the food. The young woman approaches Locke and asks if he was going to capture spiritual bodies today, and the boy replies that yes. Marriott tries to encourage our protagonist, saying that he would succeed. Seeing that all the other boys that get irritated at the attention, Marriott gives Locke and begin to doubt the boy's abilities. Seeing this, Marriott gets an idea. She says she would bet 2 gold coins that the newbie would be able to defeat a spiritual body, and Corin wonders why he was being used as a wager. He decides not to think about it and gets ready, saying he's curious to see how strong he's become after receiving the stat points the day before. So he decides to test the basics first and begins using his Serpent's Omen thrust skill. Corin says that the technique he used to defeat the spiritual body the other day was a more complicated skill, so now he would use something simpler to test. The young man says that it will probably be hard to even land a single cut, but when he attacks the spiritual body, he manages to defeat it with a single strike. All the adventurers who bet against our protagonist are simply astonished. Locke realizes that he had really become too strong. Marriott approaches, praising Locke for managing to defeat the spiritual body with just 1 blow. The protagonist, seeing that the girl had managed to follow his attack, asks what kind of eye ability she had. But suddenly Marriott hands him a bag of money, saying that it was his share. She explains that thanks to him, she earned a good amount, and of course he should receive a part as well. The boy is happy and thinks that there isn't a single person in the world who hates money. And in his head, he starts praising Marriott, calling her smart. At night, the boy Corin starts walking through the academy, thinking that in his past life he fought tooth and nail to improve his martial arts. He also says that he had a long way to go, but he was improving with the spear way too fast. The problem was his magic rune, which consumed too much mana. Corin thinks he wasn't able to solve that in his past life, since magic runes consume a huge amount of mana, and if he could just fix that, he would become stronger than in his past life. Suddenly, someone calls out to our protagonist and he recognizes the voice. He explains that no matter how much he improves his spear or masters rune magic, there's already someone in the academy that he couldn't defeat. And that person was the only female character that even Park Si-hoo couldn't kill, and one of the strongest powers in the heroic legend of Arhan. The one incapable of breaking any balance, inflexible Jiangshi, Horan, the celestial Yaksha. He wonders why the girl was there and why she spoke to him. However, he decides to just ignore her and walk away, since she's a ticking time bomb he couldn't deal with. But Horan looks at our protagonist and says the boy was a match. With a terrifying expression, she says that Corin was not the owner of that body. Our protagonist becomes frightened, wondering if Horan knew that he had possessed that body. The boy says that Horan is a paradoxical being who holds the soul of a demon and a human in her body. In other words, it makes sense that she could see his true identity. Horan asks Corin what it felt like to crush and consume the original soul of that body. But mockingly, the young man simply replies that he didn't know. In his head, he thinks that in his past life, he worried about whether he and Corin Locke were different people. The boy also wondered whether the memories of Corin that had assimilated into his own didn't also belong to him, and where his former self was, but in the end, it was meaningless. However, that must be different for Horan since her body really does belong to someone else. Apathetically, the girl says that our protagonist wasn't the true owner of that body, and that he was just a thief who had no right to it. For some reason, Corin starts talking about the hero Hulk and how he shared a body with Bruce Banner. The boy tries to explain that the funny thing was that Hulk and Bruce had opposite personalities and hated each other, but they were both good at different things. Corin says that what he was trying to say is that regardless of whether it's the original soul or the newly formed one, both have different characteristics, and that's how they coexist. And like it or not, they were born in a body, and being born is not a sin. Huaren, hearing that, seems to feel offended. She says that for some beings, yes, being born is a sin. As she walks away, our protagonist thinks that he understands the agony of that child well, but he couldn't do anything about it right now. Thus, the young man says goodbye to Horan and leaves the place for good. The girl, on the other hand, seems thoughtful about everything she heard. The next morning, our protagonist is walking through the academy. The boy says there was a reason why he woke up so early. It was because he wanted to see the mission board. He explains that the small and large missions there help you level up for the main quest. However, his goal wasn't to level up that way, and there was no need to cling to that, since he just wanted to test something. Either way, he wanted to know why the hell Alicia was next to him staring at him. In his head, the boy mentions that he didn't have much information about Alicia, since in his last life she was killed by Park, and her memories were different from the game. Alicia breaks the ice and greets our protagonist, and in response, he asks why the young woman was after missions since she was a rank 2. Embarrassed, the girl explains that she needed money, and Corin asks if the support funds for rank 2s weren't working. Arden reveals that she didn't receive those funds since her family was considerably wealthy. Locke, hearing that, thinks it was similar to Korea's scholarship system, where financially well-off students don't receive support funds. Alicia adds that because her parents strongly supported her independence, she had to cover her own expenses, and that moves Corin. The young man then reveals that if the girl needed money, a patrol mission was a great cost-benefit option. The girl invites Corin to come with her, but the boy says he had something to do. Korin states that weekends are precious and he was going to complete as many missions as he could and raise his stats. His first mission would be to find a lost kitten, and even though the experience and payment were small, his only objective was to make use of his commandment. Because if he saved the butterfly pattern kitten that nearly died at the hands of aquatic monsters, he would be able to prevent the misfortune of its owner losing her pet. Thus, we see Korin returning the kitten to its owner and receiving 5 attribute points due to his commandment. Screaming like crazy, the boy says that his plan really worked, and that meant even trivial missions gave him stat boosts. To farm status points, he starts helping various people like a boy who was being bullied by some thugs, or a couple who had lost their wedding ring on top of a roof. However, suddenly Korin remembers that he had a more important mission than gaining points, which he had forgotten. In a house that looked like a restaurant, screams can be heard. Inside, the owner of the place was irritated, saying that this wasn't what he wanted either. The man says he made his sauce with over 10 ingredients, but nothing so far had managed to satisfy his craving to make delicious chicken. Interrupting his thoughts, someone approaches the door. Locke confidently simply says the old man should add starch syrup, and with that, his problem would be solved. Then Korin says goodbye, and the old man wonders what was wrong with that lunatic. Confused, he asks who the hell would add starch syrup to a sauce. But even so, he decides to do it. After tasting the result, the old man is shocked, shouting that he had done it, and Korin, confident, thinks he won't leave the Koreans of that world without yang yum chicken. The young man receives 5 more points, which leaves him confused since he didn't expect the commandment to apply even to selfish desires. Like a lunatic, he starts celebrating, saying there's nothing wrong with helping someone make yang yum chicken. Horan was nearby, on top of a roof, just watching Korin go crazy. Rudely, the girl calls Locke a weirdo. Suddenly, the blonde teacher from Merkaba Academy appears, saying that Horan shouldn't leave without her permission. The girl simply ignores the woman, which leaves her confused. Horan remembers our protagonist saying that being born isn't a sin. But then, she also remembers someone saying she shouldn't have been born. Looking at the horizon, the girl seems deep in thought. We then skip to another day in a forest called the hunting field. The same blonde teacher from before says that today the first-year students would be evaluated through their survival tactics in the hunting field. She explains that whoever reached the cabin in the north at the end of the forest would be approved. For now, she asks everyone to put on their armbands showing their rank, also saying they could return them at the end of the test. The woman also declares that depending on how long they take to arrive, they would receive fewer points, and these points could be exchanged for a prize later. Looking around, our protagonist notices that Horan wasn't there, but that was normal since the girl didn't participate in practical activities. Alicia calls out to Korin, and the young man asks if she had completed the mission, and the girl responds yes, thanks to him. Then our protagonist offers her a honey bomb, making Alicia very happy since she loves that candy. The teacher starts the test by striking the ground with her whip. A purple magic circle appears above the heads of all the students. Korin says that he's seen all kinds of mages, but the only person who could create spatial magic for that many people was Madame Josephine. The boy is finally teleported, appearing in another part of the forest. He realizes that the test had barely started, but there were already 2 students fighting. Locke explains that the hunting field is an event that works like a battle royale, in which you start in a random location and have to steal other people's armbands. Thus, the young man leaves those 2 kids fighting, while stating that he had no interest in them. Besides that, he remembers that the most dangerous person there was ranked 2 Alicia with the blue armband. An arrow appears on Korin's finger pointing in a direction, and the boy says that since Korin wasn't there, as long as he handled Alicia, the rest would be free points. Korin also reports that Alicia might not know, but he had placed a tracking rune on the candy she ate. And with a scary expression while licking his spear, he says that rune will make them meet again. Then like a lunatic, a young man starts running looking for his target. Elsewhere, Josephine tells the director that she too will go to the forest to prevent any accidents. However, the woman gets startled and asks the man where that child was. The man promptly replies that he didn't send her because Korin went on her own. At that moment, we see that the girl was right behind Korin, and the director concludes that he thinks something has changed in that girl's heart. In the middle of the forest, we hear some people chasing Alicia. The young woman looks very tired, and even so, she asks her enemies if they didn't think it was unfair that several people were attacking just one person. But we see that she had already defeated all of them, and one of the boys responds that what was unfair were her abilities. Suddenly, a martial artist appears from behind Alicia trying to attack her. However, this boy is hit by a stone thrown by someone. Alicia realizes that it was our protagonist who did that, and the girl is happy, calling the boy kind. Our protagonist says something, but the girl doesn't manage to hear it. Then while trying to attack her, Korin speaks louder and says that he found her blue armband very pretty. Feeling betrayed, Alicia says that she trusted him and even thought he was a good person. And in his head, Locke explains that the girl is a rank 2 knight. He explains that she still couldn't use some of her abilities, and that's why he chose her, and like a madman, he asks Alicia to be a good person and surrender. Korin also comments that she is incomparable to her prodigy sister, but even so, Alicia was very strong and defeated 7 rank 3 and 4 students who had formed an alliance. Because of that, she hadn't worried about the rank 5 knight Korin at all, until 30 seconds ago, and so we see the girl defending against an attack. Looking at the monster in front of her, the girl comments that Locke was very strong. Arden states that the fighting style and strategy of our protagonist were bold, and he was pressuring her and counterattacking her. However, Alicia realizes that Korin has openings, and if she targets those small intervals between his blows, she will win. So Arden tries to pierce Korin, who seems to already expect that. The boy says that the girl lacked practice due to her excessive confidence in her talent. Thus, he uses his spear to block and deflect the incoming attack. Then he uses capture, pushing the opponent's weapon downward. Finally, he executes pierce, which consists of a straight thrusting attack. Korin says that by combining those basic techniques, you create the most basic and extreme counterattack. In other words, that was the Spear of Determination technique in its purest form. At that moment, Locke lands a direct hit to Alicia's stomach with his spear, sending the girl flying several meters back. The young woman feels the impact of the blow, but right after, she tries to recover, landing on the ground. Alicia starts coughing while thinking that if she hadn't blocked that with her aura, it would have been dangerous. She comments that it's not like he's strong or super fast. It's that his mastery of the spear is on another level. Looking at the monster in front of her, she wonders how that boy was only rank 5, stating right after that she was completely defeated. Our protagonist then takes the girl's armband and comments that he'll make good use of it. Suddenly, an explosion happens and a curtain of smoke rises. Hearing that, Korin gets startled and asks what the hell that sound was. A huge sword is launched toward Locke, who barely manages to defend himself. Analyzing the situation, Korin states that it was a magic sword made of heavy iron, which is denser than regular iron. The unknown person who made that attack is surprised that the boy blocked his heavy iron sword. The boy recovers his blade while telling Korin to leave that armband there and go away, and we see that the boy was surrounded by swords. Locke recognizes him and realizes that it was Dron, and the boy comments to himself that he really didn't want to run into that guy there. Korin mentions that even after defeating countless people, Dron hadn't even been hurt and was actually enjoying it. And he was really different from Alicia, so Korin concludes that there was no other way, and since that happened, he would run. And so the boy does, thinking that fighting Dron right now wasn't a good idea. Worski, seeing this, is quite confused. However, assuming an aggressive stance, he states that Korin really was carrying a blue armband. So he begins to chase Korin while blowing everything up around him, even making Alicia follow our protagonist in desperation. In his mind, Locke declares that it doesn't make sense to fight and he just needed to take the armband to that place. But upon looking at the cabin where he should leave the object, he realizes that Cranel Ludin was blocking the entrance with a huge golem. The orange-haired boy apologizes but says he would only let Korin in if he gave him the armband. Alicia shouts to Cranel that it was very unfair since he was blocking the entrance to their refuge. Our protagonist, on the other hand, thinks that the situation was very difficult because in front of him was Cranel and behind him was Dron. However, he mentions that even trying to avoid a fight, he would have to face 2 people at the same time and there was no escape. The boy takes his stance with his spear and Alicia questions whether that lunatic was really thinking of fighting 2 people at once. Locke states that if he couldn't avoid combat, he had no other choice except to face his enemies, and so we see the 2 opponents advancing toward Korin. However, we skip to some time later when the sun was already setting. Someone starts knocking on the cabin door and the people inside are surprised that the first place contestant had already arrived. Korin introduces himself, showing the 3 blue armbands he had captured and asking if he could choose his prize. The old man praises Locke and says he really was impressive, but the boy replies that he just got lucky, and at that moment we see that he had defeated Cranel and Dron. On the other hand, Alicia, who had just watched everything, thinks that Korin was truly incredible. She explains that Korin pierced through the core of the magic sword at the perfect moment, driving it into the ground and preventing Dron from recovering it. Then he dodged Dron's swords, which he couldn't block, guiding them toward Cranel's golem. Moreover, he got behind Dron and used him as his shield against the golem's attacks. While Dron was blocking the golem, he struck the creature's crystals and neutralized it. After that, Locke dealt with Cranel. The girl also thinks that his reaction speed was impressive and resembled someone who had fought many times on a battlefield. Alicia comments that basic spear techniques combined with experience were used to overcome his weaknesses, and it was like watching her talented sister. Remembering what Korin said to her, the girl lets out a small sigh. Determined, the young woman affirms that she should also try to work hard to surpass herself. Dron, devastated, thinks that before he could even show his power, he was attacked, and furious, he questions who Korin was. Cranel, still recovering from the blow he took, seems thoughtful. The boy begins to have a flashback, and in it, Korin tells him that golems are easy targets, and that's why he recommends Cranel have a friend to guard his back. However, the sad orange-haired boy replies that he had no friends. And after remembering that, he becomes even more furious with the boy who defeated him. The narrator then explains that on that day, the 3 named first-year students would remember Korin and Locke in their own ways. Later, we see our protagonist celebrating his feat, while thinking that the strongest person left in the hunting field is the druid protected by the forest, the green-haired girl Yule. However, the participants weren't the only ones present in that test, and at that moment we see Mariette charging a powerful water attack against Yule. And finally, Korin concludes that the strongest person there was the great mage of Merkaba Academy, Mariette Dunalef. At that moment, the blue-haired young woman launches her attack at Yule, who can't even react. Korin explains that since the seniors were playing the roles of monsters and helping with practical training, the battle was very unfortunate for Yule. And that was how the training in the hunting field ended, and at that moment, Mariette tries to console Yule and introduce herself to her. However, the girl senses a strange presence. When she turns around, she sees Quirm and asks what the girl's name was. Marriott notices that Horan had defeated several similar-looking people for some reason, and she soon assumes that the nun was looking for someone. However, Horan ignores her and continues toward her goal, which was our protagonist. Suddenly, a wall of ice appears in front of the girl, and Marriott asks her to wait. Marriott explains that according to the rules, she was now a monster, and therefore she couldn't ignore Horan. The red-eyed girl, seeing this, turns and states that it was very annoying. Back to our protagonist, the boy receives a total of 117 points, which was something impressive. He looks at the list of prizes he could choose from and becomes indecisive about what to take. The boy thinks that among those items, the most valuable was the bear shark bile, but he came there with one thing in mind. And that's why he would go with that, a mandrake seed, and the teacher congratulates the boy on his good choice. Then the boy asks what he should do with the 17 remaining points. So Korin chooses a nutritional supplement for plants and a pair of ear protectors. As he leaves the cabin, he thinks that this shopping experience was good, and it was the first time he did so well even after playing that game many times. Moreover, the boy mentions that it was his first time seeing those guys finishing too. At that moment, we see Jaeger and Lark running toward the cabin. Korin congratulates the two for working together, and Jaeger becomes even more confident. Looking at Crannel, who is searching for something, Korin asks Jaeger for help in finding the core of the boy's golem. He offers to help Crannel, but the boy doesn't seem to be thankful for it. And even so, Korin doesn't give up. In his mind, Locke states that in his past life he worked a lot with Crannel, since golems are the best type of tanks possible. Finally, Luden manages to recover his precious golem core. On the other hand, Alicia wasn't doing so well since she had been injured. Dron wasn't in the best condition either, as his battle power had been reduced to 0 with some of his swords being broken. And at that moment, our protagonist comes across Yule, who apparently was dead. The boy immediately thinks that this wasn't possible since the teachers would never let that happen. Suddenly, something makes the entire ground in the area shake, leaving Korin confused. The animals and monsters of the forest run in all directions to save themselves. Yule, with the little strength she had, asks Korin to run away because Marriott was doing something. Our protagonist starts talking about Marriott's abilities like a blessed amount of mana, and the girl was truly a genius with tremendous talent. And to her, that hunting field was like a playground, and the girl just needed to manage the difficulty to help the freshman improve. In other words, for Marriott, that was just a game. But at that moment, we see that the girl was going through a hard time. Hueren, furious, charges at her opponent. As a means of defense, the blue-haired girl summons some ice crystals and launches them at her opponent. However, that doesn't even scratch Hueren, who continues advancing. Junalef realizes that she wouldn't be able to block the nun using only basic-level magic, and therefore wonders what she should do. The narrator explains that although Marriott had promised the teacher she wouldn't use magic above the intermediate level, she had already started using advanced magic. In other words, although she wanted to deny it, Marriott had already used all her power and was out of strength. At that moment, Hueren lands a direct kick to Marriott's stomach. The blow throws Marriott against a tree, nearly snapping its trunk. The young woman falls, practically defeated and injured. Even though Marriott begs Hueren not to come closer, it's no use because what stood before her was not a knight, a mage, or just a game, but rather a natural and unstoppable disaster in human form, and the nun continues walking toward her enemy. Marriott, even broken, raises her hand and begins to cast a spell. The desperate young woman commands Hueren not to come near her. Suddenly, someone arrives at the battlefield, ordering Hueren to stop. Josephine, who appears on the scene with her magic, asks Marriott if she's okay. Completely wrecked, the girl begins to answer that she is, but her body says otherwise, and she immediately faints, collapsing to the ground. The blonde teacher looks back, seeing the disaster Hueren caused. The narrator explains that during that training in the hunting field, several unexpected results occurred. First, the student who received the most points was a rank 5 student, Korin. Second, the ace of the first year, Hueren, and the ace of the second year, Marriott, fought. Korin says that scared him since he thought Marriott had awakened as a boss, but she appeared to be fine, so things were going according to the plot. He decides to think about that later since there are still about 3 weeks left until her awakening, and for now, he needed to prepare something. Around the hunting field, Korin comments that he went there to meet a being that lives in the forest. First, he decides to put eye drops in his eyes, but for some reason, acting, the boy pretends to slip and drops the seed he had obtained into the water. Locke starts screaming desperately that that was the precious seed his mother left him. However, a being appears and asks why Korin is crying. Korin explains that in that game, there is an Easter egg that can only be seen once, the Golden Axe Taoist Hermit. The boy informs that the Easter egg is based on a legend where the hermit asks the woodcutter whether the axe he dropped in the water was gold or silver. And there was no different result even if you threw other items into the lake, but an old player started a random item challenge. That way, the hermit begins to ask our protagonist whether the silver or gold seed was his, and he replies that it was not. While thinking that no maniac would throw the mandrake seed he worked so hard for into a lake, and at that moment, the hermit grabs the seed the boy had dropped. The old man says that must be his, and pretending to cry, the boy replies yes, while thinking that he was the lunatic who had the courage to do that. The hermit, on the other hand, says that even after seeing gold and silver, Korin remained honest, and for that, he gives the boy all 3 seeds. Korin starts to bow while thanking the hermit for his kindness. With a manic expression, Locke thinks his items were duplicated. Locke reports that the mandrake seed has the effect of increasing your mana, but those gold and silver seeds have special effects. Also in his past life, Park Sihu ate the gold seed and he ate the silver one, but now both were his. The young man also thinks that what causes Marriott to become the first boss and awaken as a special vampire is the mission that will happen in 3 weeks. Furthermore, that was the reason he demonstrated his power to the rank 2s, since the first thing that makes them interested in a player is their natural talent and strength. And in a few weeks, the named ones will be fully recovered, and at that moment he will propose the creation of a group. Because the first boss of the heroic legend of Arhen, the special vampire Marriott Dunalef, was close to awakening, with only 3 weeks remaining. At that moment, a blonde girl beside Marriott wakes up, realizing the young woman was also awake. The woman begins to worry, asking the girl how she was doing. Korin concludes that if he has preparation, enough faith, and enough members, he will easily be able to save a girl from her misfortune. But until then, he had some goals, one of them being to train Alicia, hire the sword control mercenary, convince the forest druid Avaloan, and finally, get closer to the golem sorcerer Crown. And that was perfect and he just had to prepare properly, but that was only as long as no unexpected variables appeared. But at that moment, Marriott awakens her vampiric side and lunges at the person beside her. Another day, we see Horan closing a book while thinking that it was a pain. The girl remembers Josephine scolding her and giving her a long lecture. Looking at the window, Horan wonders if she should jump the wall and escape from there. Suddenly, someone appears upside down at the girl's window, and that person is Locke. The boy introduces himself once again and asks if Horan could open the window. Cora then hands a cake to the girl while explaining that he didn't want to come empty-handed, so he brought a gift. The nun comments that it was against Academy rules, but the boy replies that he was just hanging from a tree, and besides, Josephine wasn't there. The boy is really surprised by the punishment Horan received, but he says he understands since she was a dangerous special demi-human. However, at that moment, Horan reveals that Josephine didn't just step out, she had left more than 4 days ago. Hearing that, Corin is completely shocked and astounded. The boy ends up falling from the tree and hitting the ground. He says goodbye to Horan and comments that he'll go buy something for the girl to eat later. As he runs, Locke states that if Josephine left the most dangerous person in Merkaba Academy alone, then something abnormal happened. At that moment, we see the magic representative teacher Dina and Professor Firmak looking for something, and upon seeing that, Korn comments that it was really strange. Elsewhere, a white-haired guard was protecting a door, and he tells Corin that the boy's request had been denied. However, Locke says to Kron that he only came there because Madame Josephine told him to bring something for the guard to eat. The man is impressed and flattered by that, while Corin thinks that his request to visit Marriott was rejected. Furthermore, Isabel, who had been guarding Marriott, disappeared, and the fact that a guard was protecting a sick person's room was very strange. At that moment, Kron begins to feel something in his stomach after eating the food. The guard asks Corin to protect the door for a minute while he runs for the bathroom. Our protagonist enters the infirmary while stating that what was happening was a month early. He hopes his suspicions are wrong, and while pulling the sheet from the bed, he finds something he didn't want to see. The boy realizes that lying on the bed was Isabel in the place where Marriott should be. However, Isabel had been declared missing. Upon seeing the bite marks on the woman's neck, he states that this was what the teachers wanted to hide, that Marriott Dunalef had awakened as a final boss and a vampire. Putting his hand over his face, he can't believe that this happened 3 weeks before the original date. The boy states that to defeat the final boss of the first act, there are 4 phases of attack strategy. Phase 1 was to easily deal with the monster horde using a large number of people. Then Phase 2 was to trap Marriott with magic circles and gain an advantage after dealing damage to her. After that comes Phase 3, which is to face a powerful enemy that originates from Marriott. And when that enemy is knocked out, the final pattern and last phase is activated. Corin also states that even without the protagonist, if it's a combination of the named first years, it won't be too difficult to reach Phase 3. However, Alicia Arden was injured because he had hurt her. Also, Dron Worsky had his weapon destroyed, and that too was his fault. And finally, Crano Lubin had his golem's core destroyed, and he was responsible for that, and all the named first years were taken out of action because of him. Completely desperate, the boy thinks that he was totally screwed. The boy recounts that in the original plot, after finding the vampire killer from the city of Mist, Marriott attacks her own roommate. And in his last life, after that happened, they waited under the dormitories where Marriott was to deal with the situation quickly. However, Park Sihu deliberately let the girl go, and in that life, thanks to him, things became total chaos because Alicia had her bones broken. Cranel's golem core was shattered, and he was basically useless. And he even thought of Hueren, but he couldn't predict how the situation would change if she joined. So there was only one choice, and in the training hall, our protagonist was explaining the mission details to Dron. The knight comments that the mercenary rule is not to join battles they can't win, and he only had 2 swords now since his main one was broken. However, our protagonist offers 20 gold coins and an item called Soul Dust. Dron immediately agrees and joins the boy. In the library, we see a book being flipped through. Yule asks Corin how he knew that, since she thought all the records had disappeared, and the boy replies that he knows what her traditional alphabet was. The boy also comments that he knows she was there to find that out and states that if she helped him, he would teach her. The druid, without thinking twice, accepts and asks what she had to do, joining the boys' group. In a meeting with Jaeger and Lark, Locke begins to say that the mission was practically impossible, but if they succeeded, they would gain honor and fame. The 2 boys seem a little uneasy, and Corin asks himself if he went overboard. However, the boys immediately smile, accepting the offer. After gathering the whole group, Korin thinks that he has completed the minimum requirements of the first phase and that was the best he could do for now. Remembering Park's words from his past life, the boy realizes something. He recalls that Park said Marriott had hidden in the forest and there was only one forest in Merkaba Academy, the hunting field. At that moment, some people in our protagonist group question whether Marriott was really there. Dron asks how they could find her, but Korin replies that searching would take too long and there was only one choice. So he asks Yule to ask the spirits and the girl is surprised that he also knew about that. The girl immediately strikes her staff against the ground. She begins to cast a spell, asking the spirits to guide her to Marriott. Korin thinks that judging by his group's reactions, countless spirits responded to Yule. Of course, he couldn't see anything, and at that moment the boy asks if the druid succeeded. The four in Korin's group seem surprised by something and Locke asks what they're looking at. They try to warn the boy, and at that moment, Locke turns and sees a monster behind him. The boy manages to cut the creature in half while asking why that thing appeared out of nowhere. Dron immediately warns everyone that there were many monsters ahead, and Jaeger asks if Marriott had turned into a monster. Korin replies no, and at that moment, Lark starts using his grimoire to cast a spell. Jaeger also prepares, stating that this will be a great warm-up. Our protagonist begins giving instructions to his allies. After assisting Jaeger, he asks Lark to cover the rear. Then Locke also orders Yule to stay with Lark and Dron to just do what he knows. Dron thinks that Korin wasn't even nervous, and he was experienced in leading and strategizing, and there was no doubt that their academy's test was completely wrong. Jaeger comments to Yule that he thought Marriott was there, but there were only monsters, and the girl simply replies that that was what the spirits told her. The blonde asks if Marriott was controlling those monsters, but Lark replies that that's impossible, since monsters don't move in groups like that. Korin responds that Marriott isn't a puppet master or anything like that, and she can't control those monsters easily. Then Dron asks why those creatures were attacking them, and Locke begins to explain. He says that monsters attack based on their own habits, but occasionally a desperate situation can occur. Something so abnormal that they can't even react, and at that moment the four in Korin's group are shocked by something. Then we see that the one who did that to the monsters was Marriott, merely frightening them. Korin tells his allies to get ready, asking Yule and Lark to move to the back. He also asks Dron and Jaeger to take a step back and provide support since he had a plan. Then our protagonist says he will take the lead. At that moment, the third commandment that our protagonist swore to save the world is activated, and his stats increase by 50%. Korin explains that the system values will take into account the impact Marriott will have on the world. And at that moment, the system gives Korin the mission that consists of the first step to save humanity, that is, to stop Marriott. So Korin's group prepares with everyone in their proper position to attack the vampire. Something happens, and then Korin's two commandments come into conflict. Marriott walks toward our protagonist's group completely out of control. Then an update occurs, and Korin's mission is now to save Marriott. The girl, completely consumed by her vampiric powers, starts to cry. Yule, upon seeing this, feels moved, but Dron replies that that changes nothing, because they must subdue the demon tribe, and suddenly a sword flies toward Dunalef. However, Dron notices that a red shield formed around Dunalef. Lark explains that that's an orb, a skill of the vampire race. Our protagonist asks everyone to calm down since Dunalef hasn't replenished enough blood yet, so she can't do anything but block. Dron replies that this is a problem as the greatest weakness of mages is defense, but Dunalef has just activated a strong shield. The girl suddenly screams, asking for all of her enemies to disappear as she charges an attack. Korin immediately calls for the druid, who already knows what to do. The girl places her hand on the ground while saying that she doesn't know many places. But that forest was her natural habitat, and suddenly several trees grow in front of the group to protect them. Thus, the drops of blood launched by Marriott are blocked by Yule's barrier. Jaeger and Lark start to panic, afraid that the protection will be destroyed. However, Yule manages to endure it, but thinks that just that already took half of her mana, and she wasn't fully recovered from the hunting field. Korin realizes that the druid was already reaching her limit. He asks the girl to hold on a little longer, because he's going to turn the game around quickly. Yule, almost giving up, asks if Korin can really do that, and the boy replies yes. Marriott, on the other hand, while making her blood attacks, begins to charge an even more powerful strike. Locke states that the vampire boss, Marriott, is divided into 4 phases, and Phase 1 consists of surrounding monsters attacking the player's group. Phase 2 is when, after defeating the monsters, Marriott fights by herself, and for everything to work, they need to go from Phase 2 straight to Phase 4. In other words, until the final phase, she isn't using her full power. And that situation is practically the same as what happened before, both in the game and in his past life. Korin demonstrates deep knowledge even of Lark's abilities, and so he gives a command to the boy, who is surprised by that. The protagonist asks Lark to go now and move away from the group to avoid danger because Yule will soon join him. Locke concludes that so far the number and quantity of attacks have been large, but they weren't very powerful. The real problem was the alchemy magic that came afterward. Thus, Korin realizes that moment is coming. Suddenly, the drops of blood begin to crystallize around Yule's barrier. Then they begin to explode, completely destroying the shield. Jaeger and Dron are completely astonished to see their protection being broken. Still, Yule doesn't give up and begins to recite some words from her people. She starts casting a spell while calling for the help of the spirits. Korin realizes that they were responding. The boy thinks that it was a spell that even if he had memorized the text, only a pure-blood druid could activate. He explains that even though it resembles rune writing, it is something entirely different and secret, only obtainable after completing Yule's scenario. This was a 1,000-year-old secret script belonging to a family that loves the spirits and known only to the sages of the forests and those devoted to nature. Then we see Yule summon a giant wicker doll. Yule is simply stunned that she actually managed to do it, and Korin thinks it was a bit of a cheat on his part to help the girl achieve that. At that moment, Locke orders Jaeger to give the wicker doll a barrel that was still alive among the monsters they had defeated. The blonde realizes the boy was really right, and Locke thinks he had prepared all of this while everyone else was rushing into battle. At that moment, Jaeger throws the barrel toward the giant wooden doll. The creature hits a drum located in the center of the tree monster's chest. A reaction begins to occur and lightning spreads through the monster's body. Korin explains that when a sacrifice is burned inside the wooden prison or the doll, the golem-type magic weapon is activated. Thus, Yule gives the command to the monster, and the creature deflects Mariette's attacks. The druid begins to suffer, and Korin states in his mind that it will be hard for Yule to keep that doll active. The boy then tries to motivate the girl, asking her not to stop because if she did, everyone would die. The giant monster continues walking toward Mariette. However, the girl is out of her mind and soon launches an attack at the monster. The creature keeps moving, not showing signs of being affected by Mariette's attacks. Locke says that the divine doll is not a living creature but a structure, and having holes in its body won't break it, so it's fine. But that was what he thought, and at that moment a spear made of blood flies toward the doll. The attack pierces the creature's chest, making it start to collapse onto the ground. Korin can't even believe that the fire of the divine doll has been extinguished. Suddenly, the monster crashes to the ground. Our protagonist declares to himself that the only chance he knew just fell apart and collapsed. So that was a special level difficulty. Yule begins to writhe in pain, and Korin asks her to move away. The girl tries to refuse, but the boy replies that she won't change anything in the fight because she was too weakened. So she leaves, and Jaeger asks Korin if they were really going to manage on their own. Our protagonist states that Mariette has used all her long-range attacks, and that meant it was time to end it, and with his spear in hand, he charges at his enemy. Jaeger and Dron run after the boy, asking him to wait for them. Mariette still hadn't used up all her energy and continues launching blood-made weapons at her enemies. Dron uses his ability to enchant his sword and throw it at the shield protecting Mariette. However, the weapon causes no damage and doesn't even pierce it. He thinks that's annoying and very resistant. Jaeger, on the other hand, leaps while smiling and spins his weapon. He lands another blow on the orb, destroying it easily. Korin says to himself that that is Jaeger's special attack, Accumulated Destruction, which stores the hits the boy received. Jaeger celebrates breaking the orb, but ends up lowering his guard. At that moment, Mariette's Phase 3 is activated, and her eyes fill with blood. Once again, she begins to scream in pain as a blood field is activated. A dark red orb emerges, launching everyone far away. Sometime later, we see Dron's and Jaeger's weapons on the ground and the two boys unconscious. Our protagonist explains that they were trapped in this field because when the blood orb breaks, a trap is triggered that binds them. He comments that instead of Mariette, who was only performing minimal defense, the orb forcibly drained her blood and created that creature. Korin states that he never imagined he would be the last one left, since to complete this normally at least 3 people are needed for the final phase. However, with a smile on his face, the boy says that doesn't matter because the result will be the same. If you are born human, you are rationally capable of distinguishing livestock that can be slaughtered from someone of your own kind. And if you're human, it's natural to ignore it, while watching the desperate struggle of livestock that doesn't want to die. Back in time, we see Mariette waking up, and the girl feels a strange flow in the air. Mariette felt a chill rising from the depths of her feet to her spine, and something in her throat was bothering her. When she looked to the side, for some reason, the girl felt an enormous attraction to her roommate's neck. Then, on impulse, she bit Isabelle. Her sharp canines pierced Isabelle's skin and reached her veins, and the livestock was faintly trembling. Mariette saw Isabelle not as a human anymore, but as an animal to be slaughtered. The painful sounds of Isabelle's moans were like a piano melody to Dune Aleph. And after sucking blood from the girl, Mariette's veins seemed to stop, and it felt like they were expanding. Moreover, Isabelle's moans and the creaking sounds of the bed also stopped. Only Mariette's heartbeat could be heard, and the delicious scent of blood was now suffocating and nauseating her. Her body, which had felt so good with the vitality she had sucked, now seemed to collapse. Because now Mariette realized that what she had done wasn't slaughter, it was a crime, as she had almost killed her friend. Something unconscious awakened in Mariette because when she realized she had treated a human like livestock, the girl clutched her hungry stomach and ran far away, entering deep into the forest and hiding as much as she could, until our protagonist came to find her and save her from her misfortune. The creature created by the blood orb takes a bipedal stance with a dog-like face. From the monster's throat, something begins to emerge. Then it fires several spiked balls toward Korin. Our protagonist calls the dog an idiot as he uses his 6-step thrust technique. Immediately, the boy cuts through all the attacks coming his way and advances on the monster. On the other hand, the creature places its hand on its chest. It rips out some pieces of its own body, which when thrown away, transform into small dogs. Korin isn't intimidated, and seeing that, says the creature really is a dog. The boy manages to slide across the ground, passing under one of the small animals coming toward him. After that, he uses his skill again while gripping his spear tightly. Then he throws it at the two dogs, piercing and finishing them off. After retrieving his weapon, he starts mocking his enemy. Korin turns around saying that this was much simpler compared to the dog's earlier scream and asks if it had anything else to show. The creature seems to understand the insults and becomes irritated. In the blink of an eye, a monster disappears. Korin realizes that the monster hadn't vanished completely and was only moving faster than he could see. While a blue aura covers his body, he wonders if he should teach that dog a lesson. As the creature charges toward Korin, the young man thinks that what he needs to win is in 1,000 steps, since the most important thing was to look for weak points with a single step, and so he dodges the dog's attack. The young man states that this would never work because he had already seen that move before. Thus, the boy begins to prepare one of his most powerful abilities, the Ascending Serpent Heavens. After unleashing the attack, the blood orb that had trapped him and his comrades begins to crack. That prison around them is finally destroyed and Korin is freed along with his companions. As the entire blood barrier dissipates, we see the dog monster defeated on the ground. Even after everything, the creature seems not to have given up and Korin asks if it will protect its creator until the end. But finishing it off and showing a bit of pity, Korin states that the dog committed no crime. Confidently, Locke says that he is definitely going to save the monster's mother, who was Mariette. At that moment, the vampire's final phase is activated. The protagonist explains that as soon as this phase begins, Mariette puts one of the group members in a critical condition. At that moment, the woman leaps into the sky under the moonlight. Korin continues saying that's why you definitely can't defeat her alone, since normally to save the person targeted by Mariette and her bloodlust, the entire group must approach together and remove her from the target. Duinalef, on the other hand, charges at Korin while the boy thinks that no one could help him now. The girl bites the protagonist's neck while using her blood absorption ability. Locke, while having his vitality drained, realizes that this is what it feels like to have your life stolen. But clenching his fist tightly, he says everything is fine because he will endure. Thus, his ability, Persistent Warrior's Regeneration, is activated and he states that he could withstand something like that. Even suffering greatly, the boy says he is trying to bring back that child everyone knows, the one who always shared potatoes with those small hands, because he was Mariette's hero. At that moment, the boy places his hand on the girl's head. He hugs her while gently caressing her hair, also asking the girl not to rush or she would choke. Mariette releases our protagonist's neck as she begins to return to reality. Korin reports that Sabansha drank the blood of her servant the moment she awakened as a vampire, and not even a great commander could resist that bloodlust. But on the other hand, in her past life, Mariette lived feeding on monster blood and drinking seawater and was later captured by Park. But during the time she was free, Mariette didn't kill anyone and she resisted temptations and her thirst with superhuman willpower. That was an unnecessary setup for a final boss, and that's why Korin wanted to believe another ending could exist. And at that moment, Mariette begins to cry. The vampire starts apologizing to Korin while the boy thinks that everything that happened doesn't matter. The boy reveals that maybe he sees Mariette only as a character just like Park, but the teachings of his master, whom he met in that world, made him a different person. And while having a flashback of his master, our protagonist states that the person he once despised for being just a game NPC had protected him, while calling him a child, and as her successor who saw her final moments and her disciple who studied her teachings, he would follow what he learned. Determined, Korin asks Park Siu to watch because he is going to walk a different path from his former friend. We then go to the spatial prison created by Professor Josephine, a master of spatial magic. Inside, Mariette was eating a potato and celebrating it. Suddenly, Korin appears saying good morning to the girl and startling her. The boy asks Josephine if he can enter Mariette's cell, and the blonde allows it as long as he stays safe, and the boy soon enters. Our protagonist asks Mariette to eat slowly or she'll choke. The young girl finally manages to swallow what was stuck in her throat. Locke is surprised because he thought the girl's taste would change, but she still loved potatoes, and Mariette retorts that potatoes are always good. However, suddenly Korin approaches the girl, making her embarrassed for some reason. She starts hitting him, claiming he smelled bad and asking him to back off, but the boy replies that it's not a problem. The girl pulls away and Korin sighs, saying it's not like she's the one smelling bad. Mariette says she was scared, which surprises our protagonist. The girl explains that Korin was really frightening and she even thought she would die and was so scared she couldn't do what Korin did. Locke starts thinking that meeting Korin awakened something in her that made her change her mind and take part in the hunting field practice. Because of that, Horan met Mariette during training, and to confront the girl's magic, Horan used her true power, which provoked the vampire inside Mariette. Duinalef starts praising Korin for not giving up, not even that other day when he fought against spirits or when he faced her as a vampire. And then the girl says that the boy was really cool, making Korin a little flustered. With an embarrassed expression, he simply says that he likes happy endings. The boy comments that he loves when the heroes are rewarded and the villains punished, and that kind of story still moves him. That's why the boy says Mariette was a good person, besides being very cool and pretty. And anyway, he would like happy endings to happen whenever possible. Summing up what he was trying to say was that he wanted Mariette to be happy, and that makes the girl blush like a tomato. She says she needed to wash up and finish eating potatoes, and so Duinalef asks the boy to leave. The young man says goodbye and walks with Josephine toward the portal to leave. In her mind, Mariette thanks our protagonist for comforting her, but then she says she wasn't sure if she really deserved to be happy. Corin reports that Marriott will be temporarily isolated since after everything that happened, it's hard for her to return to normal immediately. But her isolation will end soon since even Horan, who was the epitome of demonic demons, was walking around freely. Besides, even though Marriott has awakened as a demi-human, most people won't feel threatened by the fact that she is one. Suddenly, someone appears beside our protagonist, calling out to him. Ariukasa, the headmaster of Merkaba Academy, asks if Corin could spare some of his time. The white-haired man asks how Locke was doing, and the boy replies that he was fine and wonders what the headmaster wanted. Kessar then reveals that he wanted to talk to Corin about Marriott's punishment, which leaves Locke shocked. The boy states in his mind that he hadn't even considered that Marriott might be punished, and apparently that wouldn't lead to a happy ending. Corin starts trying to explain, but Kessar doesn't listen and just replies that Marriott's punishment had already been decided. Even so, Locke doesn't give up and says that something like that couldn't have been decided so quickly. But laughing, Arya reveals that it was just as he expected. With a smile, the man asks Corin to relax because there will be no punishment for her. Kessar reveals that he doesn't believe Marriott is dangerous, but he wanted to see the attitude of someone who had fought her. That's why he declares that now he has no more doubts about his decision and also asks Corin not to worry because she will be released soon. Anyway, Ario says that he heard the stories from the other students, but he was curious about the details and so he wants Corin to explain what happened. Locke later reveals that he explained only what was safe to reveal, like the fact that Marriott was safe, and that child was not a monster. After hearing everything, Kessar thanks him and reveals that they will need to make an official announcement about it, but without exposing everything that happened. And now that he had heard all the details, he needed to do his job. Immediately, the headmaster of Merkaba Academy bows to Corin, who is startled. Iryu thanks the boy for helping them avoid danger, and for that the professor apologizes and says that if Corin ever needs anything, he will do his best to repay him. Corin in his mind thinks that Kessar is a very honorable person and someone who always recognizes his weaknesses and tries to take responsibility. Our protagonist then remembers his master saying some kind words to him. That's why Corin thinks that remembering the words his master told him in his past life, he trusted in Aryu's goodwill. The boy asks the headmaster to raise his head and then fulfills his request. Back to Marriott, the girl was lying in a prison cell, deep in thought. The girl remembers the moment Corin hugged her and comments that his hand was soft and his skin very warm. Because of that, the rationality that had been swept away from Marriott was pushed back by waves of emotion and reached solid ground. And when she finally rediscovered her humanity, the only thing Marriott could say was sorry. However, since she was someone who liked people more than anyone, her guilt took over because she had hurt Isabel. That's why she didn't resist Josephine's magic in any way, which imprisoned her. So when Corin visited her, she ended up pretending otherwise. But in truth, Marriott was exhausted. She was a beast, a monster, and a demon, an enemy of humans who could desire blood at any moment. However, the protagonist's words saying he wanted her to be happy made all her worries fly away. More than anything she had heard so far, those words sounded honest because she remembered the moment Corin practically sacrificed himself to save her. That strong and warm moment, and the boy's sincere goodwill and devotion, left Marriott embarrassed. Furthermore, Dundalef realized that a piece of her life would remain forever immortalized in her memory. Back to our protagonist, the boy was listening to a conversation among some first years at the academy. They were talking about Marriott's situation and what had happened, and we see that a week had already passed since the incident. Even though some people opposed Marriott's continued presence at the school, since Corin was already attending the academy, that opinion quickly lost strength. But several first years still wondered whether Marriott was dangerous or if she was still in isolation. However, Corin reveals that officially Marriott's isolation had ended and she had been freed. Still, one doubt remained in the girl's mind and she was worried. Marriott looked around in all directions searching for Isabel, the person she had hurt. And even though she had been freed from her prison, that didn't mean she was ready to let go of all her guilt. Dunalev thinks that Isabel probably hated her since she would never want to be friends with someone who bit her and tore a piece from her. And feeling really sad with herself, the girl thinks that if that were the case, she would rather disappear from the academy. However, some knocks on the door can be heard. Marriott goes to the door, opening it and wondering who it could be. Isabel, who had been hurt by Marriott, quickly throws herself into her arms, hugging her friend. Desperately, the girl asks how Marriott was and how she was feeling. The two continue talking, confused by the situation. The mage asks if Isabel wasn't afraid of her, but the girl is confused. Isabel apologizes but reveals that she saw everything that happened before she passed out. The face of her friend after biting her and not knowing what to do with the guilt. In fact, Isabel tells Marriott that no matter what happens, they will always be friends. That's why the young girl says she would like Marriott to think of her as a friend too. The blue-haired girl starts crying, thanking her classmate for her kindness. Isabel reveals that she had already been feeling well for a while, but the hospital didn't discharge her even after Marriott's isolation ended. And she says she only managed to escape because a tall freshman helped her get out of the hospital. Corin, walking through the corridors, thinks that trust in a girl like Marriott wouldn't collapse because of an incident like this. Dumalef, covering her face in embarrassment, thinks that Corin helped her once again this time. And with her face as red as a tomato, the young girl keeps thinking about our protagonist. Locke says that this is how the first part of the story ended, with a happy ending for everyone. The boy says this didn't happen in the game or in his past life, and even with different things happening, he enjoyed his experience even more. Since even without the player, the world goes on, and even without following the plan, better endings exist. With a smile, Korin thinks that this moment helped him trust in the beginning of a new world. Another day, Korin is talking about how his schedule is kind of lonely, with repeating classes, lunch, training, dinner, and more training. However, he needed to get stronger quickly because that girl's scenario was approaching. The young man then uses a skill called Venomous Dragon's Exit. Suddenly, someone arrives, impressed by that move. Marriott congratulates Korin, commenting that he was amazing and working hard today. The young girl decides that since he was working so much, she would feed him, and then she shares a feast she had prepared for the boy. Korin thanks her and says he will eat with gratitude, and Marriott is happy. However, since our protagonist had been training, he starts to bleed a little, which begins to attract Marriott. He asks if there was something wrong with his face, but the girl promptly replies no while getting embarrassed. Waff remembers that the girl was drinking blood, and she responds yes, but from a blood bag, and our protagonist asks if there is a difference between bagged blood and pure blood. The girl says yes, also remembering that his blood was very tasty, but as she says that, she starts to get tangled in her words. Coming back to herself, Marriott explains that it's like the difference between frozen meat and fresh meat, and Korin laments that the girl is doomed to eat frozen meat forever. He reveals that it's fine if the girl drinks his blood from time to time. Upon hearing this, she panics, asking what the hell Korin is talking about. Korin starts teasing the girl, showing his neck while saying he would regenerate anyway, so it wouldn't be a problem if she took a little. The young girl refuses and then pulls a potion from her pocket, offering it to Korin and saying that it's very good for the body since vampire blood is one of the best ingredients. The boy drinks it, and Marriott replies that it's embarrassing to watch him drink her blood in front of her. At that moment, the boy begins to receive various benefits for having drunk high-quality elixir. Korin says the drink didn't taste good, but it really gave him a huge strength boost, even more than in his past life. He says it was great and thinks that with this, he could start the next scenario with that girl. Suddenly, we see a pair of female legs walking among some people. The narrator explains that Alisha is a direct descendant of the renowned Arden family of swordsmen and a rank 2 knight whose life suddenly changed. After being humiliated by a rank 5 knight, she realized she needed to improve and began working hard for it. But that changed some time ago, and at this moment, we see the girl smiling at something. Alisha starts enjoying some honey chocolates while seeming unfocused. The narrator reveals that deep down, Alisha was a lazy person with no aspirations, and although her talent was immense, her attitude didn't help her develop. While shopping, Alisha thinks that when she's there, she doesn't have to get tired or swing her sword 1,000 times, and above all, there's no sister there. Celebrating, the girl says she will enjoy that moment until Korin interrupts her. The boy starts teasing Alisha, saying she hasn't been to the training room lately, and the girl begins making excuses for it. Locke ignores that response and asks the girl if she wants to join his group because he had something that would earn a lot of money. The girl starts complaining, wondering why Korin kept looking for her. It became hard for Alisha to approach him since when she was in front of Korin, she felt that her lazy habit of relying only on her talent was exposed. In her mind, Alisha starts complaining that Locke's methods are way too hard. However, our protagonist says that if she accepts, she'll get 2 gold coins and the difficulty is rank 2, and upon hearing that, the girl is tempted. She promptly agrees, and Korin says they will depart in the middle of next week. The boy also says he was planning to go on a mission that would yield 20 silver coins, and the girl immediately agrees to go with him too. Korin realizes that all he has to do is talk about money with her, and she agrees, and that will be enough to complete the girl's scenario. Besides, the boy also thinks he wasn't sure, but based on his prediction, it would happen today. Locke says that Alisha likes patrol missions because she just had to follow a designated route through the city and check for any problems. That was easy because the monsters approaching the city were at most rank 4 or 5, with the rare chance of stronger monsters appearing. We see the girl after defeating several creatures, while the narrator states that there's not much to say since Alisha liked earning money without much effort. Above all, there was something even better about these missions, and at that moment we see several soldiers praising Alisha for her skills. Hearing all those compliments, the girl becomes truly emotional and quite smug. Remembering all the insults her family used to throw at her, the girl states that she probably wasn't as bad as they made her seem. Our protagonist was with the girl on this mission and praises her for having managed to defeat an owlbear with ease. At night, the patrol had already ended and it would have finished with ease, safety, and much happiness, so long as no change occurred, of course. And at that moment, the sky begins to glow green. One of the guards reveals that this is a signal that rank 2 monsters have appeared, and it's created by a magical flare that can only be seen with special glasses. If nothing happens during a patrol mission, you can finish it without even killing a single monster, but when changes occur, you have to participate. All the soldiers at that moment begin saying it's okay because they have the granddaughter of the sword genius with them, and Korin realizes he was right, because the rank 2 monster nest found by the previous patrol group was a den of wolves led by a werewolf, and the werewolf was the creature Alisha defeated even while poisoned, and this time they would also be able to defeat it easily. But there were problems, and at that moment we see a black knight, half-skeleton, riding a zombie horse. Alisha, desperate, wonders what the hell that thing was. She realizes that this monster was a Dullahan, a rank 1 monster. As she prepares to draw her blade, the girl asks why a Dullahan was there. Arden begins to draw her sword, activating her skill that fires beams of light at the Dullahan. However, while twisting its entire body, the monster manages to dodge, and Alisha wonders what kind of flexibility that was. Suddenly, the greenish energy binds Alisha. After capturing her, the monster begins pulling Alisha toward itself, and the girl thinks that rank 1 monster is way too strong. That's why she starts crying and calling for Korin's help, since the pride of a warrior was something Alisha didn't have. The soldiers try to tell Alisha that Korin was fighting another monster, and Alisha wonders why he wasn't there when she needed him. Suddenly, the Dullahan moves in to kill the young warrior. Desperate, she closes her eyes, expecting the worst. But suddenly, the monster's bones start flying in all directions. After the undead horse and Dullahan have their heads torn off, Alisha falls to the ground, still bound by the monster's bones. The young girl thanks whoever helped her, but she recognizes that person's sword. We then see that this was the eldest daughter of the renowned Arden family of swordsmen, possibly the next heir and the greatest swordswoman of their generation, the one who would carry on the path of the sword genius Lunia Arden. And the woman says that Alisha was still as weak and lazy as ever. Not only that, but this was Alisha Arden's older sister. Seeing her sister in that place, Alisha is surprised. Lunia asks what the hell happened and why her sister was in that state. The woman also asks why Alisha didn't retreat when she saw the Dullahan and why she didn't analyze the enemy properly. Moreover, Lunia even criticizes the way Alisha unsheathed her sword, asking afterward who she was desperately trying to imitate. Arden tries to apologize, but Lunia is merciless and says that the result of those actions is entirely her responsibility and they won't be resolved with mere words. Irritated, the swordswoman also demands that Alisha realize her rash actions endangered the soldiers who trusted her. The woman even strikes her sister's shoulder to correct her posture. Lunia states that the swordsman of Arden must always be confident, and Alisha just listens, agreeing. After that, the woman turns her attention to our protagonist, who was wondering if he had been caught. The boy reveals that, in fact, he was just watching Alisha while pretending to be busy. The woman walks up to our protagonist and introduces herself as the great disciple and master of the sword pavilion, Lunia Arden. Korin bows, saying he is the disciple of the 8 hanging spears and a friend of Alisha. Lunia seems intrigued, and Locke realizes what she meant. The boy says he couldn't reveal his spear skill because only 2 people aside from himself used that technique. And those were renowned individuals, one of whom was our protagonist's master in his past life. Lunia replies that if Korin doesn't want to talk about it, that's fine, and then the girl's soldier informs them that they've dealt with the monsters in the area. Korin explains that the elite troops of Arden consist of rank 2 knights, and they are known as the 5 Swords, all of whom are at the same level or above Alisha. The master of the sword pavilion tells the 5 Swords that there is no need for them to go after the monsters that ran away, so they should withdraw. Lunia also mentions that Alisha would go with them, which leaves the girl surprised and scared. It is explained that swordsmen tend to like traveling in groups, and those who are commonly called the sword faction or fencing organizations. They follow their leaders and eventually see themselves as a sect, and 60 years ago, the sword genius Garen started a new generation of swordsmen. As the current head of the family began spreading the idea of martial arts schools, Arden became a renowned family representing the continent. We go to the Arden studio in Merkaba. The family master asks her subordinate to light her cigarette. Additionally, the narrator concludes that the lingering smell of her unique command, discipline, and gangster tendencies still remain to this day. We then see several swordsmen bowing before Lunia, and Alisha, after introducing herself, greets the first master of the pavilion. The other swordsmen wonder what is going on, since even though she is the great disciple of the main family, Lunia shouldn't make Alisha kneel. Lunia begins analyzing all the missions her sister recently took part in, disgusted by how weak they were. She even questions what that cafe helping mission was, and Alisha responds that she had to work for a cafe for a short time. For that, she had to wear a uniform and hand out flyers, and Alisha says she only went on that mission because she thought the uniform was really cute. The black-haired swordswoman, hearing that absurdity, shows a disgusted expression on her face. While smoking, the woman calls her sister ridiculous. The woman scolds Alisha for using her guardian certification for something like that, and then questions if she's trying to stain the Arden name. Lumia asks if Alisha is doing those missions to think she's a hero and boost her own self-esteem. Upon hearing that, Arden remembers a white-haired man saying that she must not forget or run away from her essence. Thus, the girl seems to grow even more downcast and sad. After receiving the scolding, Alisha departs in a carriage. The 5 Swords praise the girl, but ignoring that, Lunia asks if anyone knew that boy who had the spear. One of the 5 Swords reveals that the boy was just a rank 5 called Korin. Lunia retorts that this is impossible while wondering if Merkaba Academy's ranking test is unreliable. The girl reveals that Korin's gaze was on Alisha from start to finish, even while he fought monsters, and that wasn't the behavior of someone inexperienced. Moreover, she says that his spear technique was different, and the narrator explains that at first glance it looked simple, but to someone who had reached the peak of the Arden style, Lunia recognized the path of that spear technique. With a smile, the woman says that even though she only met him for a short while, she was satisfied with that friend of Alisha's. And if that boy stayed by the girl's side, she might evolve, and besides that, she remembers a request she received from the academy and thinks she might meet him again. Back to Korin, he reports that Marriott was increasingly bringing him potatoes and meals. While eating, the boy says that the meat is amazing, and Marriott explains that the meat was today's fresh raw meat. Crying, Locke thinks that while she lives the sad life of a vampire eating frozen meat, he's living the good life. Marriott stays very cheerful, seeing that Korin is enjoying her food, and she asks if he likes stewed oxtail. Taking his classmate's hand, Korin says he likes it a lot, but he ends up sounding like a soap opera heartthrob. The young girl seems to grow shy from that and then begins to compliment our protagonist's hands. Suddenly, someone arrives at the scene called by Mariette, pulling her out of her trance. We see that it was Isabelle, and Mariette, embarrassed, promptly runs over to her friend. She says goodbye to Korin while our protagonist thinks he doesn't understand anything about girls that age. The boy explains that in his previous life he couldn't date even once in 3 years because of Park's interference. Sometime later, Korin comments that his current platonic relationships are very different from his past life. Sometimes Yule brought him rare and precious mushrooms from the forest, and they would go straight to the library and begin Ovum alphabet lessons. Moreover, Dron also comes looking for him quite frequently, and instead of friendship, Korin thinks Dron considers him a very useful colleague. Aside from that, he usually hangs out with Jaeger and Larks, since both boys are part of his class, and suddenly the two boys scream and fright at something. Our protagonist turns around, wondering if there was a monster there. But it's revealed that it was just Horan asking why Korin hadn't fulfilled the promise he had made. Hearing that, our protagonist is relieved but wonders what promise that was. He remembers that a month ago he had promised to buy a meal for the girl, and he's surprised she still remembered that. At that moment, Jaeger and Lark leave the area, frightened, and Korin says goodbye to them. Elsewhere, Locke reveals that Horan seems like a cat, and that's why he brought the girl there. At that moment, the boy notices the girl was eating an entire raw fish, and he is surprised by that. The young man scolds the demi-human for being too rude with food, so he presents her with a dish of cooked fish fillet and rice, while saying that instead of simply consuming, she should look with her eyes and smell it, because that was showing respect for the food, and the girl seems excited. She starts eating desperately, and Korin asks the girl to savor it slowly. In his mind, he thinks that the production of the weapons is almost finished, and it's a bit early, but the second part will begin soon, because the introduction of the second part is exam week. At that moment, we see Jaeger completely desperate because he didn't know what to do since he hadn't studied at all. Lark says there's no point regretting it 10 minutes before the exam because he knew he had to study. The boy asks if Korin had studied, but the young man reveals that he didn't need something like that. In his mind, he apologizes to his classmates but says it's not the first time he's taken that test, so he'll be in first place. At that moment, the teacher gives the order for them to begin the test and turn the page. Korin, with a smile on his face, declares that he'll begin since he already knows the answers. However, upon reading the first question, the boy is simply stunned. Desperate, he wonders what the hell he could do. At the end of the test, Jaeger wakes up after having slept, and Lark asks if Korin did well. But the boy replies that he only managed to write his name, and Jaeger mocks him since even he answered 2 questions before falling asleep. Korin remembers that in his past life he never studied, but he says it's okay because there are still ways to redeem himself in that school. Elsewhere, we see the conference hall for the festival. Locke informs that the highlight of the semester exam is the game event and a golden opportunity to recover grades that dropped during the written exam. It basically consisted of 15 students per team facing off against a teacher or knight and receiving a grade from the instructors in charge of evaluation. Korin concludes that since he's a rank 5 knight, a level of the instructor won't be high, and he wonders if he'll get bonus points for defeating the instructor. However, he concludes that no matter who it is, he'll defeat them and recover his written exam grade. But suddenly, the boy realizes that his classmates are acting strangely. Someone who seems to know our protagonist asks if the boy is okay. It's revealed that the instructor was Lunia, who was happy to see Korin again so soon. Shocked, the boy asks why that woman was there. In the first year practical exam for Group A, one of the teachers presents the special guests for the test, the elite of the renowned Arden fencing family, the 5 swords of the First Sword Pavilion. And at that moment, one of the girls asks if they should go easy on the students. All the other students rush for the 5 swords while Dron analyzes their chances of defeating those ranked 2 girls. However, at that moment, the 5 swords begin to use their abilities. They use the combinatory technique of the 5 swords, and in doing so, a blast of energy is launched toward the freshmen. All of them are hit by the attack or by the debris it created. Some of the students can't see due to the cloud of smoke that formed, and Dron realizes this will be harder than he expected since the girls were experienced. The boy decides to first gain a proper line of sight, and at that moment, he starts spinning his sword. However, the phantom sword Milia appears behind the boy. Dron uses his large heavy iron sword to protect himself and questions whether those women were ambushing him. Alicia, who is also in Group A, turns around worried about her friend, but at that moment, Jenny asks the young girl not to get distracted. The swift sword charges at the girl while stating that she will be her opponent this time. She says there are about 15 students, but that won't be a big problem. At that moment, Jenny knocks Alicia down while claiming that the young lady's stance was very unbalanced. She then tries to strike her opponent with the blunt side of her blade, but the girl manages to dodge to the side. The people in the audience are truly excited by that madness. At that moment, we see that several students are trying to attack Lena May and Surin simultaneously, who are calmly handling them. And the only ones truly giving them trouble were Alicia and Dron. However, things were looking bad for the students as Dron's experience clashed with that of the 5 swords. But as the dust settled, Milia was being overpowered by Dron's 5 magic swords and would soon be defeated, making him the victor. Alicia, on the other hand, was having a hard time. Jenny dominates the fight while stating that the young lady needed more practice because at that rate she couldn't claim to be the heir to the Sword Emperor. The swordswoman even says that at this pace, Alicia shouldn't even worry about graduating and that it would be better for her to quit school and train at home. But the girl refuses and then pushes her opponent back with a strike. Alicia says she needs to use the perimeter's vision to see the domain. The swift sword strikes her enemy again while saying that she must keep her focus until the end. Confused, Corin says that Lumia Arden was supposed to take that role of guiding Alicia in the original story. However, in this life, she was the examiner for Group B, and that was very strange. Lunia decides to start her massacre and tells the students to think of this as an experience in a war against a special rank. Most of the students don't seem intimidated and wonder what the hell she's talking about and what a special rank war is. It is explained that a special rank war originates from a monstrosity that can face an army alone and is a powerful disaster. A monster that most guardians will never encounter in their lives, and the kind of story that's hard to believe. But when it came to Lunia, it was something completely different. Because that woman is someone who can face monsters like that. A monster among monsters. At that moment, the girl uses an ability that destroys the ground of the entire arena. The weaker students begin to suffer attacks while Corin just hides. Jaeger, desperate, appears near Corin and says that he almost got killed by Lunia and asks why she's going so hard on them, but Locke reveals that she's actually going easy. Locke sees something in his friend's hand, and the boy reveals that it was Lark and that he saved the kid because he figured he'd be in trouble if left alone. The blonde boy tries to advise our protagonist to hide, but at that moment, the boy is hit and thrown forward. After defeating those warriors, Lunia says they are far too insignificant to receive any guidance from her. And even with Locke hiding, Lunia still communicates with him, saying she knew he was the only one left and that he could come out. The young man raises his hands and wonders if he could surrender, and the woman says that if he wanted to get a low grade, yes, he could. However, she knows the boy wouldn't do such a thing because he wouldn't want to waste a rare opportunity to face someone like her. Locke declares in his mind that it's clear she really is Lunia Arden. He remembers that many times in his other life, he and Lunia were comrades who fought together. And if his master had been his spear teacher, Lunia was the one who taught him hand-to-hand combat techniques in real life, and that's why even at the end of his life, he wasn't a match for her. But that's a wall he must overcome at some point, and if he wants to take the protagonist's place, he must surpass her through his own efforts. Seeing Corin take a fighting stance, Lunia says that's excellent and charges at the boy next. Our protagonist with his spear and Lunia with her sword clash weapons. The two begin exchanging fierce blows with Lunia starting to pressure her opponent. After defending against several attacks, Corin tries to counterattack but misses his strike. The examiner of that test uses this moment to strike at our protagonist, who barely manages to defend himself. While they were fighting, the people in the audience wondered who the hell that guy was, since he was supposed to be only rank 5. Confused, they asked how a rank 5 knight was really fighting against Lunia Arden. After defending against so many blows, our protagonist seemed to be out of breath. Lumia noticed that he was out of energy and commented that it was truly a shame. The examiner began to put away her sword, and Corin wondered if that meant she thought he had already done enough. However, he promptly rejected that idea, as this was supposed to be a domain rupture. He realized this was the prelude to one of the most powerful techniques of the great sword emperor Garand, and it was the lethal intent. At that moment, Lunia began to prepare, and the young woman, while holding the hilt of her sword, emitted an extremely powerful energy aimed at Corin. The other students, seeing this, asked what the hell that was and whether it wasn't too dangerous for a student. Even the teachers were shocked, questioning whether Lunia was trying to kill that student. One of them even tried to stop the test, but it was already too late and a distortion in space-time occurred. Corin thought it seemed like time had stopped, but the translucent reflection of Lunia Arden moved through the frozen time. Her sword moved slowly, as if in slow motion, while Locke thrust his spear at full speed toward Lumia's sword. However, in the midst of that frozen time, Corin realized the spear wasn't moving. He noted that he couldn't move in that frozen world, and he could only discern the stillness of the world to a certain extent. Confused, he wondered if that fight he had with Marriott had just been a coincidence, and whether he still wasn't able to control the domain. But in that moment, he denied it, affirming that he only needed one step. It didn't have to be perfect, and the only thing he needed was to take a step forward. At this moment, Locke's spear collided with Lunia's blade. The girl was simply astonished, unable to believe that it was really happening. At the moment the two weapons clashed, an explosion occurred, raising a huge cloud of dust. With the dust in the air, a curtain of smoke formed, blocking the view of the battle. The teachers, upon seeing this, were simply astounded. Lunia, after all that, still seemed confident. Impressed, she stated that in the end, Corin had indeed reacted to the domain. The boy, on the other hand, still stood tall with an aura radiating from his body. Before leaving, Lumia revealed that the boy should use a better spear since his equipment was too weak for his abilities. At that moment, we see that the boy's weapon had broken in two, and when looking to the side, Lunia also noticed something. She saw that Alicia had reacted differently. The examiner told Corin that the test wasn't actually important, and the reason she didn't avoid the fight was to showcase the domain. In truth, the boy also knew of Alicia's talent, and in his mind, Locke responded that this was the correct answer, since he lost but achieved his purpose. Lunia stated that she wouldn't be in the city for a while, so she asked Corin not to be arrogant or think about interfering because nothing would change. Because in the end, she would crush Alicia with her own hands. Locke in his mind said that now that he had shown the domain to her, he bet things wouldn't go as the girl had planned. Unanimously, all the instructors gave Corin the highest score and additional points in the practical test. After that unexpected result, everyone in the audience was impressed with Locke's performance. Even one of the professors asked how a rank 5 knight managed to stand up to Lunia. The instructor who had given Corin some meal vouchers the other day was surprised by everything he saw. But of all of them, Firmic was the most outraged, stating that it made no sense. The man, completely confused, questioned how Corin Locke was using that guy's techniques. A few days later, we see the protagonist thinking that even before Lunia gave him that advice, he already wanted to change weapons. A blacksmith asked Corin how the boy knew so much about his family, but Locke asked him not to think about it. The young man thought that to get expensive ingredients you spend a lot of money, so players prefer to acquire items through scenarios or quests. Besides that, he already had the special soul dust and some other items he got during the journey, not to mention the unconditional support of the director that he had secured. Thus, Locke reports that with this, he could have one of the few best weapons capable of controlling the domain. So we see that in front of him was the legendary spear of the Silver Knight of the Shadow Kingdom, known as the Silver Spear. In a flashback, Alicia is frightened, looking at someone and realizing that even though the blow wasn't lethal, it wouldn't stop bleeding. The girl remembers her first participation in a real battle in which she took the life of a monster for the first time. Even so, the young woman reports that the smell of human blood was distinct, and even though it was her first time, she understood immediately. She understood that that intense odor was the final spasms and agony of a life that was fading away. Back in reality, Alicia stares at her blade while it's possible to see that she had received a werewolf capture mission. Still, the girl comments that this mission, although bad, was better than the one with the assassin vampire of the mist. Our protagonist explains that there was a deeper reason why Alicia had chosen that mission. At that moment, the girl wonders where her savior who protected her the other day was. Suddenly, other adventurers who were in the same carriage as Alicia realize that a rank 5 was also going on the mission and start speaking ill of him. Even with several judgmental looks, Locke doesn't care at all and greets Alicia, surprised by the girl's presence there. Court explains that the other expressions of the Guardians weren't good, and part of that was because the school offered a quota system that guaranteed students' participation. And to make it worse, he was a rank 5, but while shaking Alicia's hand, Locke thinks it was a relief to have the girl there, since they wouldn't dare say anything openly to him with the granddaughter of the Sword Emperor present. Locke gets even closer to the girl and asks how her vision was, and Alicia, confused, responds that her eyes were fine. However, she realizes that Corin knows something, and so she asks if he heard that from Lunia, and the boy replies that in a way, yes. The protagonist states that Alicia needs to hurry because Lunia was dead serious when she said she would destroy her. But calmly, Arden says that when that happens, she'll simply be able to stop wielding a sword. Despite hearing that, Locke says to himself that he's sure Alicia was just saying that without meaning it. In the middle of the forest, Corin explains that in the werewolves' nest, there were 2 of those creatures and 20 hunting dogs. However, the captured group skillfully dealt with the dogs and even got rid of 1 werewolf. But the situation took a strange turn, and at that moment we see the group being surrounded by several of the creatures and wondering what was going on. One of the adventurers asks Hansen where the rank 5 knight was, but the warrior, dealing with worse things, shows that he doesn't know. Even in that situation, they feel a little more relieved upon seeing Alicia easily defeating several monsters. However, there were still bigger problems because from within the mist, even ghosts were joining the monster horde. While fighting, Alicia thinks that places with few humans don't attract evil spirits, and that's why this was being caused by someone. Suddenly, a terrifying being appears behind Arden. The girl manages to defend herself from one of the monster's blows, and she immediately realizes that it was a knight. Alicia orders the monster to go back and then asks why he was attacking her. Another knight charges at the girl, but this time she fails to protect herself and is struck from behind. The knight in front of her takes advantage of the moment to raise his weapon and prepare an attack. Seeing all this, Alicia doesn't even know how to react. However, suddenly the girl uses her sword and slices the knight into several pieces. This leaves Alicia extremely confused since not even she realized how she did it. Once again, the girl smells the distinct scent of human blood, the intense odor of the agony of a life that is fading. At that moment, Alicia realizes that she had finished off a human. But before the girl could think about it, the monster that had already struck her from behind attacks once again. This time, that undead knight has his head pierced by a spear. Corin asks why the girl was in shock like that since those creatures weren't even people. After hearing that, Arden becomes confused and Locke explains that those were corpses reanimated with dark magic. Our protagonist thinks that the main event of the opening act of the second part is the subjugation of the assassin vampire from the City of Mist. Moreover, normally the serial killer that Marriott didn't catch in the first part starts pursuing the player, but something changes if you choose the werewolf capture mission. Because during that mission, you encounter the vampire assassin John Doe, and at that moment, the adventurers run to check if Alicia was okay. However, in front of her, the girl points to a frightening hooded figure that was levitating. Alicia even tries to draw her sword, but Corin stops her, and the young man asks her to get ready to flee. Locke uses the ability of his new spear and then throws it at the lunatic. Incredibly, John Doe is hit and has his chest pierced as the spear embeds itself into a tree. Arden congratulates Locke while the other adventurers begin saying that the enemy was very weak. Locke thinks it's obvious that if John dies there, he wouldn't be the boss, and based on the peculiarities of that assassin, Corin states he wouldn't be able to catch him alone. John starts speaking and comments that it was amazing Corin managed to destroy his puppet. so the madman says he will end things for today. Finally, our protagonist concludes that the problem wasn't John's speed or strength, but his stealth, and at that moment, the puppet begins to disintegrate. Corin sees the mist and explains that it was the Crimson Mist and that when the HP of the undead mage, who is the source of the mist, reaches 0, he unleashes a death mist, so Locke states that what he destroyed was just a puppet used to activate the mist. The young man declares that the reason it's hard to capture John is because he uses puppets to communicate and avoid being tracked. Moreover, at that moment, the man was assimilated with the mist, making it impossible to capture him, so Locke begins to run together with his group. Alicia remembers that Corin left his powerful and expensive weapon behind, but he reveals that it's all right. Then the boy uses the return rune on the spear. Thus, the object flies toward Corin, who recovers his weapon. While the two students are running, they hear a loud noise coming from behind. They realize that Charlie, one of the group members, had tripped and fallen. Immediately, the two idiots go back to save that boy. Alicia reaches out her hand to Charlie, but before he can grab it, the boy sees something on his friend's back. A completely red and terrifying hand goes toward Arden. Thus, Alicia is captured and dragged into the middle of the mist while Corin says that this is way too annoying. The young man asks Charlie to leave the forest immediately and give him his cloak. After putting on the cloak, Corin starts running into the mist. Annoyed, the boy reveals he didn't think he would do this twice, since in his last life he tripped and got stuck in the mist and entered critical condition within minutes. But now he had the regeneration ability, and the only problem would be Alicia, and at that moment, we see the girl trying to free herself from the hands surrounding her. Corin imagines that blood must be being drained from her body, so the girl wouldn't last long. Alicia doesn't give up and keeps delivering several strikes while thinking she just needed to cut that thing. However, it was too late, and the girl was weakened and could no longer break free. As she begins to give in and let go of her sword, the girl questions what was wrong with her, remembering her sister humiliating her that hurt Alicia even more. At that moment, the young woman's sword falls to the ground, and she questions whether she couldn't break free because she was too weak. Alicia apologizes to her companions while saying she was just trying to be nice and save someone, so she could become a respectable person in the eyes of the guide who saved her. When the girl's hopes were about to collapse, she hears a familiar voice calling her. In front of her, the girl sees a familiar silhouette. Not only that, she also recognizes that person's voice, as if she were seeing her savior on the day she nearly died. Alicia seemed to be confused. She finally sees more details of him in her daydreams, and the woman realizes the man was familiar. Back in reality, the girl sees Corin shouting her name, and so Arden wonders to herself if that was her savior. Our protagonist finally reaches Alicia, and the boy asks if she was okay, but the girl can't even recognize him. Arden explains to Corin that whatever was holding her wouldn't come off, and then she pleads to please be saved. Corin gives the coat he had taken to the girl while asking her to wait a moment. The young man tells the girl that attacking randomly won't work, and as he hands the sword back to her, he asks her to focus, cut, and do it with strength. Locke also says that he will protect her from the undead from now on, also commenting that the girl already knew what to do. Alicia tries to cry, saying she couldn't because she didn't have enough energy and was too hurt, but Corin keeps trying to encourage her. Resting his head against hers, Locke states that among the swordsmen he had met, Alicia possessed exceptional talent and that if she decided to attack, she would succeed. Furthermore, with a smile on his face, Corin says that the girl only had to take one step, and that would be enough. Arden, hearing those words and for the first time seeing someone who believed in her, begins to cry. However, her savior doesn't waste much time and leaves the girl there while charging toward the undead. Alicia states that she also couldn't last much longer there, and so she questions how Corin, who had a lower rank than hers, would survive in that place. But forgetting that, the girl decides she couldn't let those words be said in vain. Once again, the swordswoman decides to draw her sword, but this time she was much more confident. The red hands move toward Alicia while the girl begins to explain that her grandfather has a secret technique capable of cutting anything. But to do that, she must awaken the perimeter eyes, a cursed ability that forces her to see other domains. The girl says that the falling tears, the blood, and even the overwhelming emotions become fuel to take a step toward the world where time is frozen. Moreover, she thinks she should do as Corin said and just take one step, and so she does. A bluish aura begins to form around her body, and the girl uses the Arden style single strike. Thus, a slash made of energy goes toward all the undead, splitting them in half. The girl finishes her ability, Domain Break, attacking when time is frozen, and not even our protagonist had realized it. The strike was so powerful that even John, the vampire, was also cut in half, and about to die, he asks how Alicia found him. That blow wasn't just enough to cut the undead, but to slice in half most of the trees in that forest. With John's death, the mist dissipates, and at that moment, the group of adventurers who were with Corin and Alicia approach, asking if they were okay. They immediately notice the body of the assassin vampire from the City of Mist right there. All the warriors are impressed with Alicia's ability and recognize that it was the domain break technique of the Sword Emperor. However, even the protagonist couldn't believe what he saw, since he had only thought she was using more basic attack and didn't even know Alicia was already capable of doing that. Nevertheless, Alicia, with a smile on her face, starts shouting to Corin that she really did it, but the boy still thinks she shouldn't even be able to do that. The warriors comment that this probably made Alicia the next leader of the Ardens, since no one besides the Sword Emperor is capable of using Domain Break. They all begin to celebrate in the girl's name, while on the other hand, Korin wonders why his plans always get messed up like this. Sometime later, all those events became news headlines. One of the five swords, while reading one of the reports, tore the paper angrily at Alicia's arrogance. She asks another sword to get rid of it immediately. Lunia, on the other hand, was silent while drinking her fine coffee. The narrator explains that the Arden family moves based on the logic of power, and under the overwhelming charisma of Garen Arden, they have been searching for the swordsman who will succeed him. Domain Break is an ability unknown to most martial artists, and Garen has long awaited someone who could continue his legacy. Lumia trained while dripping blood and sweat, but even the girl who was called the genius of her generation couldn't satisfy the Sword Emperor. However, one day that changed, and at that moment we see a battle between Lunia and Alicia as children. The narrator explains that Lunia's younger sister, an illegitimate child brought from outside by the head of the family who had just wielded a sword, engaged in a friendly duel with her older sister, and that would change everything, because in the middle of that fight, Lunia had never thought of that child as her competitor. At that moment, the young girl strikes at Alicia, making her younger sister retreat. However, suddenly Alicia's eye takes on another form, which leaves Lunia completely astonished. A slash is delivered and a vital red liquid splashes everywhere. All the people around run toward Lunia, while asking why her ketchup wouldn't stop flowing, since the strike Alicia made hadn't been lethal. Lunia on the ground states that she couldn't see anything. In fact, it wasn't like she could see, since when she composed herself, she'd already been cut. And it wasn't a matter of speed. It was different. That was the domain, and with that, Alicia took a step into this deep path of martial arts. Lunia continues, irritated, questioning how that was possible, since that child was small and lazy, and there was no doubt that the girl was surprised. Looking at the person who injured her, Lunia states that despite everything, she understands what her grandfather told her, because that was the twisted nature that mortals could not comprehend, for the sword domain was the talent of a demon. Thus, the Sword Emperor approaches and names Alicia as the next main candidate, and that's how she overcame everyone's objections. Lunia reports that the memory of stroking her half-sister's hair, who grew up abandoned by their father's family, probably still remains somewhere. Suddenly, one of the five swords asks the pavilion master if she's okay, and the black-haired woman wonders if her companions were worried. The woman stands up, asking the girls not to worry, while thinking that she wished Alicia would enter the domain too, because if she could see that sword once again, maybe she could manage to reach that level as well. So Lunia orders the five swords to prepare the sword challenge. Korin, in a hospital, asks Alicia when she'll recover, and the girl responds that she'll be fine in a day or two. Arden asks Korin if the boy wants a honey candy, but our protagonist just laughs and replies that she's really carefree. But changing the subject, he asks if she managed to use domain break, since even seeing the domain, she wasn't supposed to be able to use it. Alicia, completely shy, starts twirling her hair while saying that it happened because Korin believed in her. Also, it just happened that if she tried for real, she would simply succeed, and Korin replies that the girl really was a genius who skipped the hard work. Suddenly, a sound is heard at the door, and someone says they're there for a visit. Mariette promptly opens the door, asking the freshman if she was okay. The blue-haired girl and Alicia introduce themselves to each other, while our protagonist simply greets the girl who had arrived. Locke, confused, asks the upperclassman if she came to visit the freshman, and the girl promptly replies yes because she was worried. But then Mariette adopts a different aura. Completely jealous, she asks Korin if he and Alicia were close, but the boy is confused by the question. Suddenly, the three in the room hear a knock from outside the window. Appearing like a ghost, Korin calls for Locke while saying she wanted food. Mariette seems to act strangely, and Locke asks if the girl had been bothered by Horan's presence. But in truth, Dunalef just asks if our protagonist had gone out to eat with Horan, which leaves the boy confused once again. The boy promptly asks the girl not to worry because he would prepare a wonderful snack for her, and that really excites the girl. However, analyzing the situation, Korin thinks that this unexpected gathering of incredible and famous members might be a good thing because he could do it with those people. The boy reveals to Alicia that since the rumors that she managed to use domain break have spread, Luna would probably challenge her to a sword challenge. It is explained that the sword challenge is a fencing tradition meant to test the powers of the pavilion master, but nowadays it's used to eliminate successors. Crying, Alicia begins to say that if she fought against her sister, she would die and wouldn't even be able to defeat the five swords. Korin, on the other hand, reveals that he could help the girl, but he would only help her under one condition, and the girl readily agrees. He declares that if he suggests fighting monsters or training in the training hall, from now on Alicia would have to do it without complaining, and now she would be part of his group. With no way out, the girl swears loyalty to Korin while our protagonist is happy about it, but Mariette and Horan don't seem so pleased. So Korin, like a psychopath, states that through the hardship of this time, whether long or short, and with the truths he learned within his body throughout his life, he would make a decision. And at that moment, we see May walking through the city streets. Suddenly, a small dagger flies in her direction, nearly hitting her face but striking the wall. Confused, she asks who the hell did that, and then we see a pair of feminine legs walking. The unknown woman simply introduces herself as a challenger, which makes May begin to draw her sword. The young member of the five swords realizes that it was the student Horan. The nun charges at May, and the red-haired woman asks why that girl was acting that way. Horan simply replies that someone said they would buy her sushi if she managed to catch May. Meanwhile, in another location, we see Korin dueling with Lena. The woman, while defending herself from the boy's attacks, asks what that was all about and why he was doing such a thing. Our protagonist thinks that you must attack before being attacked, because that is the truth of life. And with a psychotic expression, he charges at that woman. Then we begin to see the list of members of Alicia's new dojo, and the first of them is Korin Laksh, master of the Guando style. The next is the master of the knife style, Horan. In addition, also present is the master of the flying sword style, Dron Worski. The master of the Gandalf style, Mariat Donalev, was also there and part of Alicia's dojo. Last but not least, the director and master of the new dojo, Alicia Arden. And with the attack from those members, the 5 swords of the first Arden Sword Pavilion were defeated. Lena asks why the hell Korin was doing that. With a psychotic look, Korin says that to develop a new dojo like theirs, they needed to increase their fame. That's why they were trying to expand very aggressively, and in this way, we see that the situation made headlines in the newspapers. Korin begins to explain that in the Arden family, there is something called the Sword Challenge, but even he, who wasn't part of the family, knew the true intentions behind it, and that's why he would change that structure into a dojo challenge. This way, they could defeat the 5 swords one by one in a martial arts dojo challenge format. Since in the end, what Alicia's dojo really wanted was a battle between Lunia and her younger sister. Alicia thinks that if she wins and declares victory, her sister's forces won't be able to touch her, and that's why she decided to start with that. Furthermore, all the problems they faced were resolved by Mariat, who paid for everything they needed, so Alicia says she'll have to reimburse the girl. Lunia approaches her sister and states that what she was doing was very interesting. Switching to a frightening expression, she says that Alicia should have run the moment she saw her, and it was clear that even the dojo challenge wasn't her idea. Lunia also shows that she knows the one who set up and planned everything was Korin Locke, and at that moment the boy arrives calling for Alicia. The youngest daughter of the Ardens questions whether she could really defeat her sister, so she begins to speak that to the master of the Arden Sword Pavilion, Lunia Arden, she would like to propose a friendly duel as the new master of the Arden Dojo. The black-haired girl seems to agree but leaves a warning. She says she doesn't use training swords or non-lethal weapons, and Alicia already knew that, and she simply replies that she was prepared. Then finally the two face each other, and the time is settled that sisterly fight had finally come. Mariat analyzes the duel and thinks that even if she fought at full strength in her vampire transformation, she still might not be able to handle Lunia. Because of that, she asks Korin if Alicia was really ready, and the boy replies that he believed in his comrade. Dunalef then concludes that if Korin believed in Alicia, she did too. Lumia throws a bag of money to our protagonist, who replies that it was too much for a dojo maintenance fee. However, as she charges at her sister, Lunia responds that it wasn't for that. The young woman reveals that the amount was for reconstruction costs, and at that moment, she tries to strike Alicia, who barely manages to defend. With that simple blow, the kinetic energy generated destroys and cuts part of the dojo. The strike leaves Mariat and Korin completely shocked. We then see that the attack was powerful enough to split the place almost in half and open a natural window to the sun. Lunia begins to pressure her sister even more, who was already nervous. Alicia thinks that she admired her sister, and when her passion for swords still burned, she was her idol. Remembering her past, the young woman comments that Lunia was like her fairy tale heroine, while she herself was just a concubine's daughter who lost her mother at birth. And her father saw her as a shameful reminder of his mistakes, since to him the only value she had was possessing the blood of the great emperor of the blades. At that moment, we see young Alicia interacting with her sister, and Lunia affectionately strokes the girl in front of her, saying that she had grown a lot. However, Alicia thinks that the day she cut a human for the first time, everything fell apart. We return to the present moment where the girls were fighting. She thinks that on the first attack, she should step back and then parry to the side. So she does just that, surprising Lunia, whose blow is blocked and who is nearly struck. Arden states that although her relative is skilled in what she formerly learned, the girl wouldn't be expecting irregular defenses. But suddenly Lunia demonstrates all her talent, attacking her sister and throwing her far away. After that blow, the black-haired woman comments that Alicia's footwork was still as sloppy as ever. Arden seems irritated by that comment, but soon lets it go, and then thinks she should use her speed to confuse Lunia's line of sight. Then, in the blink of an eye, she disappears from her current position and charges at her opponent. The girl uses the third form of lunge, the lightning ability, and appears behind Lunia. However, the pavilion master manages to detect that approach and quickly counterattacks the strike. Alicia barely dodges but doesn't give up, and once again throws herself at her enemy. She wraps her arms around Lunia's body and restrains her sister, but that wasn't enough. Before falling backward, Lunia executes a suplex, throwing her sister away and rising back up. Immediately, she takes on an extremely hostile stance. After that, the woman lands a kick on Alicia's face while calling her stupid. Preparing to finish the fight with her sword, Lunia asks if Alicia really thought she could defeat her with those useless tricks. However, the younger sister didn't seem willing to give up and quickly recovers, defending herself. Alicia seems to read her sister's movements and realizes that she's going to use the Mekiaza ability. And upon seeing she was right, the girl thinks that everything was going according to what Losh had said, and that's why she had to do it. Thus, she uses her blade to deflect her enemy's attack while using the combinatory strikes ability. Seeing her attack interrupted, Lunia tells Alicia that she was parrying well even against a strike that had made her kneel. So that fight wouldn't be as easy as she expected. However, she says Alicia was still inexperienced, and then Lunia uses her foot to kick her sister in the stomach. Arden is knocked back by the strike and begins to feel a sharp pain in her abdominal region. But before the girl can even think about it, her opponent appears above her, jumping and charging a powerful blow. Alicia promptly returns to the fight, using her sword to block her opponent's attack. She even tries to immediately counterattack, but the Pavilion Master was ready for it and lowers her body to dodge. Once again, the black-haired girl uses her sword, now glowing with a blue aura, to attack her own sister, who, even while cornered, continues defending herself. Seeing her sister's determination, Lunia thinks that she was catching up to her. Not only that, but Alicia was now seeing the domain. And with a smile on her face, the girl affirms that without a doubt, it was that version of Alicia she wanted to see. She wanted to see the real Alicia, the one who had denied herself all this time and hid despite all her talent. We see that Arden was already quite exhausted and breathing heavily. The girl regains her composure, breathing deeply and sheathing her sword. Lunia says in her head that her sister had already realized that victory wasn't 10 steps away. It was only one, and that's why she would respond properly. The girl takes a firm stance, emanating a strong aura, and then asking Alicia to attack. On the other hand, Alicia doesn't seem intimidated and does the same. Thus, the two relatives charge at each other in that fiercely unfolding battle. As she advances, Lunia thinks that what her sister was seeking to reach was her, and in a flashback, she sees Alicia saying that one day she wanted to be a swordsman like her sister. But now Lunia realizes that Alicia was drawing inspiration from Korin, and at that moment, we can see the girl's expression. A simultaneous strike from both swords occurs, and a micro-explosion can be seen. During that microsecond when time was frozen, Domain Rupture was used by Alicia, who made a massive slash. Before they could see the outcome of the battle, an explosion occurred, blocking Marriott and Korin's view of the fight. Marriott was completely terrified by it and questioned whether it was already over. Then we see that the victor had already been decided, but a curtain of smoke prevented us from seeing who it was. After the smoke cleared, it became clear that Lunia was on her knees on the ground and Alicia was standing. Marriott realized that her companion had won, and this made her very happy. Our protagonist says that compared to the Master Swordswoman Lunia, Alicia's only strength was Domain Rupture, so the only way to win this fight was within the domain. That's why he instructed the girl to focus on dodging and buying time, thus exploiting the habits and patterns he knew from Lunia, whom he had seen in his past life. That way, he secured a chance of victory in a domain battle, and as expected, the domain clash resulted in Lunia's sword being cut. Alicia, looking at her own hands, wondered if she had really won. Lunia, while collecting herself, realized her performance hadn't been good enough. As she walked, she told her sister that from now on, neither she nor her subordinates would interfere with Alicia's work. However, Arden walked over and grabbed her sister's arm, wanting to talk to her. The girl began to cry, and Korin explained that her friend must be scared since Alicia, who was clearly the weaker one, had defeated Pavilion Master Lunia. That's why it was understandable that she feared the looks her sister would receive, as well as Lunia's reaction in turning her back on her. But nothing went as expected. Then the black-haired girl turned around and raised her hand over her sister's head. The woman began to caress Alicia, showing herself to be far more understanding than she had seemed. Our protagonist explains that the first time he met Lunia in his past life was before the Marriott incident happened. He remembers that the entire time Lunia was searching for Alicia's killer, but in the end, she never found him since the true culprit was Park Siu. And even on the 3rd anniversary of Alicia's death, Lunia continued her search for the culprit. In a flashback, Korin tells Lunia that he thought she hated her sister, and Lunia responds that she still did. The girl states that she only saw Alicia as a lazy, frivolous, and annoyingly clingy person. But Lunia explains that besides her, there was no one else who could ease the bitterness Alicia felt. Back in the present moment, Korin says that Lunia never turned her back on Alicia, and if something happened and the girl took the lead, Lunia would silently support her with a smile. Then we see the black-haired girl caressing her sister while saying that she had grown a lot. Seeing that situation, Korin remarks that the Lunia Arden he remembered was exactly that kind of gentle and kind person. Alicia, moved by her sister's affection, begins to cry with emotion. With that battle's result, our protagonist receives various rewards. Sometime later, we see the girl recovering from the battle while confiding in Korin. The young woman explains that she was afraid to fight and afraid to face her sister, which is why she pretended to be less serious in training and sought out simpler tasks. She thinks that now that she has defeated her sister, she will officially become an heir of the Ardens, and Lunia and her followers will keep an eye on her. Therefore, the girl concludes that this will truly sever her bond with her sister. However, Korin promptly responds that this wouldn't happen. The young man explains that Lunia and Alicia's relationship might get awkward, but relationships aren't something that can be broken so easily, because in the end, the two of them were still sisters. In fact, he praises her work by saying that when he was younger, all he did was get beaten up by neighborhood bullies. And afterward, what made him angrier wasn't the physical pain, but his own incompetence in not being able to defend himself. That's why he declares that Alicia was much stronger than the weak child he had been at that time, and he hopes the girl can always be proud of herself. Arden simply replies that Korin was a really weird person. She says that even though they were the same age, Korin acted like an old man, and he thinks that if he added up all his lives, including Korin's memories, he was already 50 years old. However, changing the subject, Alicia thanks him for today's incident. While stretching, she also thanks him not only for that, but also for the help he gave in the forest as well. This way, Arden reveals that she also remembers it was him who helped her in the forest that day and saved her life. Corin asks how the girl knew, and she reveals it was because of his voice and the belt that had remained with her. But the young man replies that it was the first time she had actually thought. Sighing, Locke comments that now that she knew he couldn't lie anymore, and the girl responds that she was very grateful to him. Arden also mentions that if the boy had something to ask for, she would do it, and Corin then asks that they become friends. The young girl starts getting extremely shy and accepts but gets tangled in her words, not knowing what to say. Corin, happy, simply states that he wanted to get along with her and calls her a friend. The girl agrees and also replies, saying she's happy to have someone so reliable as a friend. Then the protagonist says that punishments await those with evil hearts, while a bright future awaits those with good hearts. Locke says that's why he hopes there will be better choices for those children in the future and that they succeed in life. We then move to Isabel, Mariette's friend, and the girl is saying she's been feeling a disturbing worry these past days. While Mariette was walking through the academy corridors, someone shouted her name. An unknown boy kneeled down, asking her to accept that bag of his blood. Seeing that, the young girl was completely frightened. Seeing this, Isabel calls that boy an idiot and says that those words make Mariette even more uncomfortable, and these things have been happening every day. But in truth, that didn't matter. Her worry was about that person, and at that moment, Corin appears asking Mariette if her class had already ended. The young girl turns red like a tomato upon noticing our protagonist's presence. Isabel reports that that boy was a first-year student who had been close to Mariette lately, and he was a 5th-ranked quarrelsome knight. However, she says that didn't matter, and the fact that he managed to defend himself against Master Swordswoman Lunia implied that he was certainly talented. Corin enters a room and asks Mariette if she wanted to take a little of his blood, and even nervous and shy, the girl accepts. The two then lock themselves inside. Immediately, Isabel starts imagining inappropriate things happening inside that room and says that was what had been bothering her all this time. Isabel hears Corin talking about a proposal, and this leaves the young woman even more confused. We see that nothing inappropriate was actually happening, and Corin was just telling Mariette that instead of rebuilding the dojo, he wanted to set up an inn. Hearing all that, Isabel asks if that idiot was trying to make a deal with Mariette and who he thought he was. Later in the training room, Alicia asks Corin if he was training again today, and the young man replies that he was practicing basic and endurance exercises. The girl says he was very dedicated, and the boy retorts that the basics are crucial in everything. Alicia then says she wants to join Corin and Isabel while watching all that like a spy, realizes that the girl was the second daughter of the Arden family. Corin gives his friend a voucher, and the girl immediately notices that it was a voucher from the Sandopada restaurant. The spy thinks that this restaurant is known as the best dating spot, and after seducing Mariette, that boy was after another girl. But at that moment, the girl ends up slipping from where she was hanging. A noise can be heard and Alicia seems to notice it, but Corin just ignores it. Isabel, ignoring her fall, reports that that boy not only flirted with 2 girls, but was also talking about money again with one of them. The next afternoon at the Horan restaurant, Corin and Horan were eating together, and the boy asks if she liked the sushi, with the girl replying yes. Once again, Corin asks Horan if she had money, and he says he had an incredible investment, just like he told his other 3 friends. Isabel was watching all of this, and after analyzing the situation, the girl immediately realizes that Corin Loch was an incredible damn scammer. Then we see a limousine speeding down the road, and Corin starts thinking about all the costs he had in rebuilding the dojo. He knows how many gold coins were spent in the fight against Lunia, and all of it came from Mariette, and that's why he should be grateful to her. He couldn't even believe she had lent 100 gold coins in cash, since he never imagined that mages earned that much. But aside from that, Nunia also offered 50 gold coins for the renovation, and Alicia had received 110 gold coins as a reward from the raid. Horan also had some funds managed by the Protestants stored away, and not only that, but Yule, Lark, and Jaeger also had some money saved. Dron, that money-crazed bastard, had an incredible amount saved up. At this moment, we see Locke stepping out of his limousine dressed like a big shot. The boy explains that in the end, he gathered 550 gold coins, and with that, he bought all that land on a plane. He explains that although it's currently just an empty plane, in the second semester, the city will host an exchange festival with another academy called Bora America. And the lodging season will be massive, and it would bring in a lot. After all, he was a possessor and a regressor, and knowing the future meant he had to use information to his advantage, and he was going to sweep all the money from that world. At this moment, the young man reveals himself dressed in a striking suit. Back at the academy, Ariu states that the stance of the Catholic Church, the royal family, the Mage Tower, and the association toward their school wasn't very good. But he comments that it wasn't something they couldn't resolve, and Josephine replies that her order would support Ariu's decisions. The director says he would be taking a leave for a while, and Josephine offers to go in his place. But the man responds that the Catholic Church wouldn't be a pleasant place for her. Thus, he asks the young woman to take care of that place while he's away, and if anything happened, to contact him urgently. Josephine then takes on a new posture. The young woman starts reviewing the papers and realizes that the experiment on the vampire's regenerative power was rejected, and the permission to build a 3rd laboratory was postponed. After signing those papers, she notices something from Locke. Upon reading the document the boy had submitted, she asks what he was planting this time. It is then revealed that in the request, Korin was asking for land to grow mandrakes. In the testing unit in the eastern zone of the academy, Alicia questions why they were harvesting mandrakes in that place. Korin explains that mandrakes scream a lot when being pulled out, so they had to be extremely careful with their ears, and it was best to do it in an open field. After they put on the earplugs, Locke asks Alicia if she was ready, and the girl replies yes. The boy says he couldn't do that process alone since while one person grabs the plant and lifts it, the other must cut the root and the stem. Because unless you do that, the mandrake will keep screaming non-stop, and that was his 4th time harvesting a mandrake, as he had done it with Park in his past life. Our protagonist then decides to go all in and quickly pull the plant from the ground. Thus, the vegetable begins to produce some sounds, and within seconds, cries and screams can be heard. Korin orders Alicia to show him her swordsmanship, but when he looks at her, he realizes the idiot wasn't wearing the ear protection correctly. The boy draws his blade and says it looks like he'll have to handle this alone. Like a madman, he tells the mandrake that it wasn't the only one who knew how to scream, and then the young man starts screaming back at the creature. He then quickly hurls the vegetable into the air, cutting its root and stem off. Immediately, the mandrake stops making sounds and falls defeated. Furious, Korin yells for Alicia to wake up while saying he brought her there to help him, but the girl was being completely useless. While staunching the sacrament in his ear, the boy thinks that he wanted to harvest the silver mandrakes, but he feels like he'll pass out if he does it alone. Suddenly, someone calls out to Korin, and the boy thinks he put up a no entry sign, so he wants to know who it is. Immediately, the young man recognizes Marriott, questioning if the girl didn't have some tests scheduled in the center. The girl replies yes, but it was too noisy, so she bailed, and Korin notices she had jumped from the 12th floor. Emitting a murderous aura, Marriott asks what the two of them were doing together, and Korin simply replies that they were harvesting mandrakes. Marriott asks if the boy was planning to harvest the others too, and he replies that he was, but he would rest before doing so. However, the girl promptly volunteers to do it for him, but Korin tries to refuse. Yet our protagonist realizes it's already too late because Marriott had already pulled the mandrake from the ground. Korin thinks that if she hears the screams of a silver mandrake, she could die. However, before the plant could even make a sound, Marriott pulled out its stem while stating that she had a garden like that at home and was already used to harvesting them. Marriott offers to make a stew and then asks Alicia to bring something like rabbit meat for them to eat, and the girl agrees. Locke, feeling lonely, asks what he should do, but Marriott replies that he didn't need to do anything. And with an extremely romantic expression, the young girl says she would do everything for him. The protagonist simply smiles and thanks her while thinking that girl was truly amazing. The narrator explains that there are 2 ways to consume a mandrake, one being the traditional method of eating directly from the root. However, the most effective way was making it into an herbal decoction, and he explains how the consumption process works. The narrator states that if you did that, you could create an oriental herbal medicine, and it seems strange because it came from a Korean game. Marriott says that now they just needed to boil it and asks what Korin was doing, and the boy replies that he was bored. Dunilef approaches and notices that for some reason he was drawing a runic alphabet, and she says she didn't know its meaning but had seen it before in liberal arts classes. The young woman asks him where he had learned it since that alphabet was already extinct, and Korin replies that his master taught him. In his mind, he comments that until a year ago he learned runes and spear techniques from her, as well as martial arts and the original runes she left behind. Besides that, he learned the methods to master martial arts, but the original runes were different because just knowing them didn't mean you could use them. That meant original runes are acquired and engraved into the body, a power that could only be used by one person. Furthermore, one of the final boss's items was to collect and possess an original rune, and although his master tried to pass the original rune to him, she died before doing so because of him. Marriott grows curious and asks who Korin's master was, but the boy replies that his master was a normal person you could meet anywhere, a normally kind person who gave her best. After hearing that, the blue-haired girl seems to become sad, commenting that Korin spoke very fondly of her. Forgetting that, the girl decides to change the subject and asks if he wants some potato, and Korin promptly replies that he hasn't eaten yet. Marriott says she had brought some, and at that moment she calls out to Diaku, and suddenly the vampire dog made from the blood orb appears beside Korin with a basket. Seeing this, our protagonist realizes that Marriott had completely fused with her orb, and she credits that success to her companion since Korin shared his blood with her. The girl also calls the creature cute, which makes the little dog very happy. However, ruining the mood, Locke says that since the dog was made of blood, half of the creature's blood came from him, and that technically made him the father of the blood orb. She then calls Korin the father of Diaku and asks the boy why he didn't play with the puppy, and the protagonist seems a bit confused by the situation. But before he can react, the dog starts playing with its father. While being attacked, the boy thinks that 1-year-old vampire dog was more energetic than he imagined. Besides that, he had to play with the animal until his energy ran out, and at that moment, we see that the soup was ready. While Korin was eating the food, Alicia asks Marriott why the boy was so worn out, and the girl reveals it was because he had played with Diaku. Thus, having ingested the mandrake herbal decoction, the boy's mana capacity is increased. Korin also shares the decoction with his friends since drinking it more than once wouldn't increase the effect. So he also considers sharing it with his other friends like Lark, Yule, and Jaeger. Besides that, the boy mentions that there was still one more thing left, the silver mandrake. So he decides to eat it by the root, doing so immediately, and with that, the system notifies that the boy's aura core has been created. The boy explains that the aura core is a vessel for storing a knight's aura, and in his mind, he thinks that when his aura rank gets higher, he could obtain more cores. Upon declaring that he now had an aura core, Marriott and Alicia are impressed as they see the aura the boy was emanating. Corin mentions that just having that effect from his silver mandrake was incredible, and Alicia recommends that he consume the golden one soon, but the boy says he would do that later. Alicia recalls that consuming so many herbs at once isn't good, and Corin agrees in his head but comments that that wasn't his real reason. Elsewhere, we see a professor talking about the 5th ranked knight Corin locked. The man states that the classification of that student needs to be re-evaluated immediately. All the academy professors begin discussing Corin and some doubt the boy's abilities. Fermax states that Corin Lord directly faced Master Swordswoman Lunia Arden, even if just for 3 minutes. Upon hearing that, the higher-level professors who didn't witness the fight seem to underestimate him and say that she must have gone easy on him. However, old Heyman, who had requested the re-evaluation, says that's a lie. He asked the professors present who watched the fight if any of them thought Lunia went easy on Corin, and the young man promptly realizes that none of those who had actually seen the battle agreed with that. Another professor says that raising Corin's rank based on one test is insufficient, and without results in accordance with the regulations, they couldn't do anything. Heyman concludes that they should leave the official ranking evaluation to the association, but they would have to deal with the student's academic schedule. And one responsible professor would need to accompany him, and the others around agree that since Heyman was the one who requested it, he should take charge, and the man seems to accept. Professor Fermac, on the other hand, was ignoring everything happening while thinking about Locke. He thinks that even rank 5 seems exaggerated based on his data, but the duel with Lunia was undeniably impressive. Furthermore, that spear technique, no matter how he looks at it, was that person's technique. That's why in his mind he concludes there's a need to assess him again. Elsewhere, we see Alicia greeting Corin. The young woman asks if she could sit next to the boy since they were in the same class, and even if bothered, the boy accepts. However, he warns that that seat belonged to Jaeger, and at that moment, the blonde boy arrives, intimidating Alicia. The boy didn't want to fight, and even though she offered to move, Jaeger simply replies that she could stay there while he jumps to the seat in front. However, Corin looks at Jaeger and notices that for some reason, he seems strangely stressed. In his mind, Jaeger says that Corin was hanging out with the most famous person in the academy, the potato veteran. He was also with the super cute girl from the demonic tribe, and now even with the granddaughter of the Sword Emperor. So in his head, Jaeger says he was freaking jealous as hell. A tough guy says Corin was living the life of a dating sim protagonist while the seats next to him were empty. At that moment, Fermic enters the room asking if the first-year students were ready to begin. He asks everyone to take their seats and begins reviewing the content from the last class. Fermac says they would be starting a group project, and the students, upon hearing that, seem bothered. But ignoring that, the professor proceeds to explain the group project, saying that since they were in the night faculty, he wouldn't assign difficult math tasks. At that moment, he casts his spell, and behind him, several papers begin reassembling themselves. Corin, upon seeing that, immediately recognizes what the topic of the assignment would be, and Fermic concludes that they would study spear techniques. Alicia turns and says that this would be quite easy for Corin, but the boy was thinking that in his past life, the topic had been boxing. Not only that, but Fermac is a boxer represented by a wide variety of ranges and footwork, in addition to his specialty, Shadow. And even being the famous rank 1 recognized by the runes in his gauntlets, he was suddenly giving a lesson on spears, and he was definitely sharp. At that moment, our protagonist realizes that his professor was literally trying to test him. Fermac informs them that this group project will involve the selection and research of a specific type of spear technique. One of the students asks the professor if that wouldn't favor the students who use that weapon, but Fermac says he would take that into account in his evaluation. He also declares that each group will be formed with 4 members, and that the group members will be selected randomly. Corin in his mind reports that people say group projects are to stimulate and assess student cooperation. But in reality, only one person does the work while the others just rely on you. As an example, we see a conversation between 2 people about a group project in which one of them was making lousy excuses not to contribute. Corin thinks that he did group work with several lazy people and says he experienced that during his 4 years as a physical education student and for 3 years at Merkaba Academy, but this time would be different. At that moment, we see that his group is made up of Jaeger, Huiran, and Alicia. The boy starts talking about his group and mentions that Jaeger is a 3rd-ranked knight with decent judgment and good at following orders. Alicia is a fencing prodigy and incredibly strong and will be able to learn physical movements easily. The last member was Huiran, and despite her attitude being a bit rude, she was quite dedicated, and seeing her focus in classes lately has been inspiring. The boy also says to himself that since the members of his group are all strong and hardworking people, he could say goodbye to his painful past. But that was what he thought. Then, sometime later, we go to the training room the boy had reserved. Jaeger is talking to Corin that they've been using that room for a while, and the walls and floor are made of high-density materials for impact activation. So the blonde asks how the hell it got destroyed, and at that moment we see Huiran dueling with Alicia. And not only that, the place was destroyed with a single punch from Huiran. Corin reports that Huiran was a lunatic as he had only asked her to do a light spar with Alicia to train spear skills, and she didn't even know what she did wrong. Because of that, they were kicked out of the training room and Korin wondered where they should train next. At the church, our protagonist states that it was time for his first reflection session on group work. He asks the members to share their thoughts openly. Alisha apologizes for yesterday and compliments Korin's skill with the spear, and the boy just replies that she did well. Jaeger, on the other hand, shows that he's struggling with a long-range weapon, but Korin also praises him. However, when he turns to ask Korin, he notices the girl was carrying wine and some biscuits. She says she wanted to eat, and Korin thinks that there's a similar culture, perhaps due to the blending of various earth religions in that world. Korin also explains that it was the blood and flesh of the saint, and that it was a mandatory weekend task. Korin asks if the girl was training to be a nun with the Protestants, but the woman replies that it wasn't because she wanted to. However, Locke says the girl should read the scriptures as there's a lot to learn from the stories of those called saints and holy women. And even if the church had some outdated views, the teaching spoke of good things. Like love, since in the Bible it says you should love yourself, those around you, and your neighbor. Horan doesn't seem to care much about that, but Alisha replies that that teaching was really very good. But changing the subject, one of them asks Horan if she knows the reason for yesterday's failure. The girl shamelessly replies that her teammates were too weak. She declares that they are weak, and even if she uses just a little force, they break, and even if they practice those things, the weak are weak and the strong are strong. However, Korin stands up angrily saying the girl was wrong, and he retorts that this is an opinion only the truly strong can express. As the shameless person he is, Korin proposes a bet and declares that within 1 minute, he would make Horan kneel, and if that happened, she would have to pay for dinner that night. The girl also accepts but says she didn't want a reward since she knows someone is going to get hurt in that battle. Now in the arena, the two face each other. Korin says they would begin the fight at Jaeger's signal, and the blonde was confused, questioning how that even happened. But the boy decides to obey and tells them both to get ready. Horan and Korin face each other with a sharp gaze. Finally, the boy gives the signal, and as he charges, Locke says that from the start, he would use his secret martial arts, one of which was his highest ranked technique. The boy uses an ability, releasing a purple aura with his spear and striking Horan. However, he realizes that she defended herself like it was nothing, and she really was as good as she claimed to be. Therefore, he would go for it, so the boy strikes his opponent with a tiger wind strike. But he immediately realizes that his spear had been shattered. Upon noticing that his opponent was empty-handed and unarmed, the nun charges toward our protagonist. However, with a smile on his face, Korin comments that she was definitely good at destroying things. Even with Horan attacking several times, the young man manages to use his body movement to dodge. He starts mocking his opponent, asking what her problem was since she couldn't land a single hit. The girl prepares to curse but can't think of anything, and just calls Korin annoying. She begins preparing a right punch while warning Korin to dodge it or he would die. Our protagonist thinks that if he got hit by that, he'd be hospitalized for a month, and according to Horan's advice, he needed to dodge. But he wasn't going to do that, so he starts forming a ball of energy in his hand to block, and the boy uses it to defend against his opponent's strike. The boy says to himself that even though he blocked it perfectly, it felt like all his muscles were about to tear. Seeing that, Horan asks how the boy had blocked her attack instead of dodging. However, immediately after, she falls to her knees and Korin appears behind the girl, leaving Jaeger and Alisha impressed and confused. Our protagonist seems very excited, smiling, declaring that the girl had knelt. Irritated, Horan turns around saying they should go again, but mocking her. Korin refuses, saying he won and wouldn't fight again. Because of that, she gets even more furious, asking him to fight again. While mocking her and refusing, the boy says he could hear her trembling and Horan was angry and frustrated. A few days later, Korin explains that it took a bit, but he successfully managed to stop the rebellion of his group members. He thought that now he could slowly teach them to master the spear and prepare for the presentation, but then he received a note from Horan saying she was sick. The young man says to himself that that was a lie, and since she wanted to play it that way, he was going to take action. Because in that case, the group project problem solver would have to use his secret weapon, and suddenly someone welcomes Horan. Our protagonist places a table full of food in front of the girl, saying that she could eat. However, if she ate anything there, she'd be admitting that she wasn't sick anymore. He asks if the girl could really refuse, pointing at a fish fillet. The girl gives in to her cravings and starts eating, thus revealing that she really wasn't sick. That way, he starts talking to her and asks how long she thinks his chef took to prepare that dish, and the girl replies it was just half an hour. However, the young man reveals that it was 10 years, because finding the right ingredients, handling them, and preparing everything takes about 10 years. Horan asks where the boy was going with that, and he says it took him 3 years to become good enough at martial arts to make her kneel once. In other words, her favorite fish and his martial arts had similarities from selecting the right ingredients to the posture they take when attacking, because everything starts with the smallest of the smallest details. The nun stops eating for a moment and seems intrigued. Locke asks if they had made up, but the girl just snorts. Soon after, she hits our protagonist in the face with a notebook, and he asks what that was. Upon reading it, the boy realizes that it was the research he had asked Horan to do. The young man starts patting the girl, saying that she did everything and looked so cute, but she gets annoyed. Korin concludes that Alisha and Jaeger were practicing spear techniques with dedication, and thanks to Horan, they didn't have to worry about the research, they were ready. Eventually, time passed, and during the first week of group project presentations, the order of presentations was sequential. Firmic finally decides to start the class and asks the first group to step forward. The leader of the first group introduces himself as Pallas and explains that their topic was the 5-star spear. So they all begin their demonstrations while Jaeger compliments them. Firmac tells Pallas that it wasn't bad at all, and the tired boy thanks him. The professor then reveals that from now on he's going to try to break through their formation. So we see the first-ranked knight of the kingdom of Ellos, Firmac Damon, putting on his gauntlets. With a terrifying expression, he says that if the students last 10 seconds, he'll give them the highest grade for the project, and the real group work begins now. Firmac then asks his students to block his attack. In the blink of an eye, the professor drops his notebook, tossing it into the air and charges at his students. With just a single combination of strikes, Firmac is able to break through the entire barrier made by that group quickly and effortlessly. Jaeger is impressed, stating that Firmac was really fast, and Corin thinks that man really wasn't holding back. Firmac retrieves his notebook and says it was good that they chose a spear technique in groups, because although they lacked practice, it wasn't terrible, so they should receive a B. And the man asks if the students had any objections, but lying on the ground, they respond that they didn't. Then after the injured students leave, Firmac continues the exercise and calls for Group 2. Another group leader introduces himself and says they chose the Northern Death Spear, 9 deadly dragons, and seems very nervous about what he just saw. Within seconds, Firmac defeats all the students in that group and states that their technique wasn't just needlessly elaborate, but also incorrectly learned. Finally, Group 3 is called, and our protagonist seems happy. Corin steps forward and explains that they were presenting the 8 trigrams land nage spear technique. The first part is performed by Jaeger, which is the land consisting of deflecting the incoming attack. The second part, called Na, was Alish's responsibility and involved pushing down the opponent's weapon. Right after that, they use the Ja, and Horan immediately demonstrates the technique by stabbing the unguarded opponent. Seeing all of it, Corin feels proud of his group, stating that it was an amazing demonstration and Horan worked harder than he expected. Firmac praises him, saying that Corin's group removed all redundancy, and though simple, the principles were excellent. Corin thanks him and responds that he was about to tell his group to get ready, but the professor says that won't be necessary and that he'll only be testing Corin. With a serious expression, the muscular man says that for the real fight, only the two of them would be fighting, stating that Locke thinks that was this bastard's plan from the beginning, and the young man accepts the challenge. Immediately, Damon takes on a terrifying stance and says, "Here I come." In the blink of an eye, he appears beneath our protagonist using his skill, Rado. He uses his left arm along with the jet pulse technique to try and strike Corin. In his mind, our protagonist thinks that in boxing, the fighter uses a special stance to throw a right hook, and normally, he should block. But Firmac's body didn't move with the right foot but with the left foot because he knew his professor was left-handed. At that moment, he uses his spear to block the attack. Damon seems quite impressed with the boy's technique, wondering how he managed to do that. The other students praise their professor's technique and movements. All the students watching our protagonist trading blows with Firmac wonder how that 5th-ranked knight could do it. In the middle of the fight, Firmac realizes that this meant Corin had already surpassed the student level. So preparing a powerful blow, he asks the boy in front of him to show everything he's got because he didn't want to see just the basics. In fact, he wanted to see that spear technique. And at that moment, our protagonist seemed confident. The boy waits just long enough for the strike to approach. Then we see that upon impact, the punch produces a huge airwave in Corin's direction. The whole group starts to worry about the protagonist's condition. However, after the smoke clears, they see that Firmac had stopped his own blow before hitting his student. He asks why the young man didn't do anything, and mockingly, Locke responds that 10 seconds had already passed. Damon remains silent, very curious about that. Corin thinks that the professor must be suspicious, since up to that point he had only used his right arm to make it seem like he was right-handed. But his response to the attack was only possible because he already knew that Firmac was left-handed. So Corin in his mind wonders what his martial uncle thought of that. The professor steps back, returning to his usual spot and starting to comment on Group 3. He says that when it comes to secret arts, men choose only flashy techniques, but honestly, basic principles are the true secret arts. Therefore, he says not only to Corin Loft, but to all of Group 3 that they all receive the highest grade for their effort and excellence. This way, the group and our protagonist starts celebrating excitedly at the news, except for Horan, who continues with his blank expression. Corin starts getting cocky and cheers with Jaeger and Alicia, but Firmac interrupts and asks if he could speak with Loft for a moment. The professor asks the young man not to feel pressured since it was just a casual conversation between teacher and student. Then in Firmac's office, the man asks Corin if he really was a rank 5 knight, and the boy promptly replies yes. Firmac mentions that the boy should be aware that his abilities don't match those of a 5th ranked knight, and the boy just retorts that he must be really good. But in his mind, he thinks that he can't feel spirits and can only capture evil spirits under certain conditions, and that's why he's rank 5. The man comes clean and reveals that the professors at the Knight Academy met and discussed the boy, and the topic was that he needed to be reevaluated. Demon explains that he would receive missions, and through them, its classification would be reassessed. Since he showed some results in an unconventional way, they weren't valid, and our protagonist thinks he might reach a semi-first rank under those conditions. And that was good since they pay more, you have more options in mission selection according to your rank, and if you were a regular player, That would be a right you'd only have after the second year, so the young man promptly accepts the reevaluation and asks what he would need to do. Fermac then informs that Locke would have to complete 2 missions involving semi-first rank monsters and evil spirits, and Korin starts thinking about the available missions. He states that in the end, he would have to capture a monster and an evil spirit. Then, emanating an aura, Fermac orders Korin to choose what he wants quickly, which makes the boy tense. Sometime later, old Heyman tells Korin that he made it just in time. We see that the two are walking through the forest and talking about some personal matters. Boasting, Heyman says he will tell some stories that happened when he was in the West to the boy. The old man explains that Korin's first hunt would be a first-rank monster located in the western mountains of the city, namely the two-headed ogre. He then shares some information about the ogre, and Korin says that normally such a creature would be first rank, but since it was still young, it was classified as semi. So the boy concludes that he couldn't launch a frontal attack since it was also raising hunting dogs. Heyman concludes that what Guardians need isn't just brute strength, and that's why he will evaluate everything in Korin, and we go straight to the western mountains of the city. Korin reports that neither old Heyman nor the association staff who came as a precaution will help him and will only intervene if it becomes very dangerous. Heyman asks Korin to tell him the results of his analysis. The boy responds that judging by the footprints around, there are signs that both the ogre and the hunting dogs are traveling together, and without a doubt, that would be dangerous. The boy also mentions that there were only 3 hunting dogs, but Heyman says there were only the tracks of 2 4-legged animals following the ogre's steps. Locke replies that one of them seems to be female and seems pregnant, as besides the tracks, there are signs of a beast being dragged, which meant that the hunted beast wasn't eaten on the spot, but rather taken to the ogre. However, neither ogres nor hunting dogs have the concept of saving food. Then Heyman asks Korin how he was planning to hunt a semi-first rank monster, the two-head ogre and the hunting dogs. He explains that he would first separate the ogre from the dogs, as the dogs are beasts with animal instinct toward dangerous things, and he would use a weapon of humanity. That weapon was the head, and unfortunately for his enemies, he was an expert at using it. The narrator states that even if humans expand their influence and navigate the world, there will always be lurking threats. These threats are demonic beings who impose their presence upon that world. The ruler of that forest was a tyrant, a two-headed ogre who ruled the forest, a place where few humans dared to tread. To him, that place was his kingdom. However, the first to notice that something had happened were the hunting dogs. Where they realized that the female, who was close to giving birth and couldn't move easily, had disappeared, they concluded that something was wrong. At that moment, the hunting dogs begin to bark and they notice a trail. Then, driven purely by their animal instincts, the dogs conclude that an intruder had taken the female. After realizing that his mate, along with the pups, had been kidnapped, the ogre expressed his fury, and the roar of rage from the ruler of the forest made the forest tremble. The two males twisted in hatred, declared in their dissonant voices that they must pursue and rescue the female. For being weaker, she needed to be protected. The hunting dogs followed the scent trail of the kidnapped female with the ogre close behind, and the female's scent grew stronger. They could even smell the intruder. As always, there was nothing in the forest that could stop them, and now was time for the foolish intruder to pay the price for disturbing the rulers of that place. And finally, the tracking ended, and what they witnessed was the female still whimpering sadly. The female rubbed her nose and checked if her mate was okay, still shocked by everything that had suddenly happened. While they tried to help the female escape, something happened the moment they tried to break the ropes that were holding her. Suddenly, as the female was pulled, a wooden tower fell from the sky, piercing and finishing her in an extremely cruel manner. Next, another log appeared, heading toward the female's mate without giving him a chance to react. The two were quickly impaled and thrown far away, finished together as a couple. And finally, they were crushed against the tree with not a single piece left. Then, the last part of the plan was completed and several wooden stakes began falling from the sky. From that moment on, the last hunting dog realized he was no longer tracking the intruder, because now he was running to survive. He spotted a clearing with no trees and assumed it would be a safe place. At the end, the hunting dog was only gasping heavily, trying to catch his breath. However, it was already too late and suddenly a spell was activated. We see that on the various stones in the area, runes were drawn, and the beast had failed to perceive the human's malevolence. Thus, an explosion occurred, finishing off the last hunting dog. The ogre, who was the only survivor, emerged amidst the destruction and murder of his offspring. Seeing one of his helpers burning, the creature became enraged, unleashing all the anger stored within him. At that moment, the ogre had already lost his loyal subordinates who had accompanied him for a long time. The furious howl of the tyrant of the forest echoed throughout the area, frightening any creature that feared for its life. However, the ogre had no time to mourn the death of his companions, and suddenly fire burned some ropes that loosened and released logs. However, he easily deflected the attack since such a mere trap could never touch the tyrant, because this figure was truly the ruler of the forest who struck fear into anyone. But he still didn't know that the hunt was only beginning, and at that moment, Cornlock appeared behind the monster just to observe him. The narrator explains that the ruler of the forest, the two-headed ogre, was also a natural-born hunter. One of the heads had good vision, while the second head had a strong sense of smell, and together, they worked to avenge the hunting dogs. He began to pursue the tracks left by his prey, and it wasn't hard because, in truth, there were so many tracks that it was absurd, since a fool who couldn't even hide his scent had defeated those unstoppable dogs. But against his expectations, on the first day, the ogre couldn't find his prey. There were definitely tracks, but even after persistently following them, he couldn't find him, and even when it seemed like he was on the verge of capturing Korin, he failed, and while camping after setting aside his unhappy feelings, he was ambushed. Suddenly, a stone with another rune engraved appeared before him. That was an attack that would have caught him off guard if one of the heads hadn't been alert, and the second ogre head awoke to the sight of hailstones falling from the sky. He quickly used his firepower and wooden club to deflect the powerful blows and defend himself. The ogre was only grazed by some pieces of hail, and it was an attack with no other purpose than to catch him off guard. But there were other continuous attacks after that, and whenever he was about to fall asleep, the hailstones fell again. After experiencing this a few times, he simply wanted to ignore it because it wasn't anything serious, and that's when flaming stones flew near him and began to burn. Despite his pursuit and the chaos that occurred at night, the prey continued, showing only ambiguous traces and, in the end, never revealed itself. And 3 days passed like that. It was then that the ogre finally realized that he was actually the one being hunted. And when he realized that his position as hunter had been reversed and that he had become the prey, only fury and grief remained. But suddenly he heard a voice, and the source of that fury finally appeared. Korin, while yawning, comments that enough of all this effort just to catch that monster. The ogre howls in hatred, unleashing all the bad feelings he had accumulated over these days. He promptly charges at Korin to kill that guy and avenge his companions and himself for what he had endured. However, Korin is not intimidated and also heads toward his opponent. The young man jumps into the air while spinning his spear. The ogre concludes that the moment Korin lands, he would use his 2-meter-long eucalyptus club and send that small body flying. However, our protagonist uses his skill, Intent of the Pagoda Tree Mountain. By using the mega hit technique, he throws his weapon toward the ogre. The ogre is shocked to see that, and being very weakened, the creature is unable to react. Thus, the weapon pierces and tears off part of the poor monster's body. The monster begins to howl in pain with nowhere to run. However, it was already too late, and Korin begins to use another of his abilities. He uses the Primordial Chaos Palm and strikes the ogre's chest. That attack, coming from a small insect toward the tyrant, seemed like nothing. However, it was enough to bring an end to the tyrant who once ruled the forest, now prey to a human. Korin, retrieving his spear, thinks that after filling his aura core, he didn't even get to use it in that fight, and that was very tedious. Our protagonist, in his mind, wonders if Marriott was okay. 3 days ago, Korin asks how much Marriott trusted him. The shy girl replies that she would trust the boy even if he said he was going to make kimchi using only potatoes. But going further, Korin asks if she trusted him that much and how far she was willing to go with him, and the girl becomes even shyer. After getting covered in blood, she starts yelling that she would go to the end with him, and Locke says he had a plan and needed her to complete it. Our protagonist decides to explain his plan and begins to say that starting tomorrow, she and Alicia would do something, but the girl interrupts him. Annoyed, the girl says that if it was necessary for the plan, why was that girl involved too, and that leaves the boy thoughtful. While Junalef is bathing, the narrator says that although she's a veteran guardian and a special vampire, she was still a young girl. And the choice of words by Korin Locke, which could easily cause a misunderstanding, was enough to make her heart tremble. But the girl was not a fool. She could see that the boy always seemed one step ahead, planning and acting before anything happened, like the day he saved her. She was not ungrateful, but wanted to understand how much that boy knew, and she couldn't help but have several doubts. However, since she had fallen in love, she had become quite blind. The reason why mages want to become professors at the academy is the incredible collection of books in the great library of Merkaba and its enormous research building. In that place, the best ingredients one can find are there, a kind mages only dream about, including special monsters that cannot be killed and can only be sealed. Thus, we see Dina talking about a giant boar that devoured a mine. Furmak tells Dana that that research was based on the alpha characteristic of the special entity, and he wanted to write a thesis on the influence of the demon tribe. The two continue talking about this, and the girl seems very happy with Damon's attitude, and to have him there to help, as rune mages are rare nowadays. Damon replies that this happens with a dead language since it's hard to use that in real battle, unless you're a knight like him with a lot of mana. The two professors notice the approach of a young girl, and Dina says she never expected a special vampire to volunteer to help with the experiment. Marriott reveals herself and replies that it was okay to be called a vampire. The narrator mentions that the meeting between the first act's boss, Marriott, and the second act's boss, King of the Iron Mine, was concluded, and the two were creatures known as specials. Haunted House Mission is a simple mission you can choose during the second semester of the original game. But to defeat the rank 1 evil spirit possessing the haunted house, you must complete a puzzle in which you dodge attacks from various household objects. Korin explains that normally he can't sense spirits, but that time was an exception because just like Duke Sabantia, who possessed Lark, the poltergeist phenomenon is when a spirit possesses a building or a house, and that means they exert physical force and cannot simply be ignored. Then we see our protagonist jumping and attacking using his spear to cut the stalk and the top part to separate the root of a tree. Next, he thrusts his spear forward and shatters the terrace window, causing shards of glass to fly in his direction. Soon after, Korin Locke dodges them by sliding and then heads toward the door to start the mission right away. The young man begins to explain everything he had to do while going through the various puzzles scattered throughout the house. Seeing our protagonist complete that mission so easily, all the professors are in shock. Korin continues and follows through the mission effortlessly. After completing it, the house he entered burns down and he walks out confidently after defeating the disaster. He starts making a face to look angry with the explosion behind him, stating that all the professors are simply astonished, and Korin explains that strategy was used by a legendary streamer who rocked the game world. Hammond at that moment approaches Korin to congratulate him, and the young man sincerely says that he was definitely confirmed as semi-first rank. Next, the old man says there's a nearby port city called Sar, and he wanted to have dinner there with Korin. Upon seeing that, the young man realizes that Sar City is the place where that thing is, and that's the reason he chose to do a raid on evil spirits in this region. The two then head out walking toward the raw fish restaurant they were going to. Looking back, our protagonist notices that Mariette's blood-made dog was following him just fine. The narrator explains that 88 years ago, in the polar region of the continent, although it was cold, it held countless natural resources, and among those mountains was a vast mine. The miners who were pioneers in the polar regions in search of iron and gold witnessed something incredible there. A giant boar devouring iron ore, and it became known as the one who devoured everything, the demon pig of the Dingle Peninsula, the king of the Iron Mountain, and that was the first sighting of this animal. At this moment, we see Alicia running while wondering why she slept in on such an important day, and the girl begins to recall the instructions Korin gave. The young woman states she couldn't be late now and would need to do what her friend had asked. A few days earlier, Alicia approached Mariette. The girl apologizes for scaring her senior and asks why she had been called. Alicia explains that she came because Doku told her to, and Mariette informs her that Korin asked her to explain the mission this time. Upon hearing that, the swordswoman seems to become shy. Before starting, Mariette offers Alicia something to taste, and Arden promptly accepts. The girl says that if it's good for her body, she'll drink it without hesitation, and so Mariette asks her to take it easy. However, Alicia starts to feel something which scares Mariette, but the girl reveals that it was actually very delicious, almost like the taste of homemade food. The senior, hearing that, seems to get excited and writes everything she needs down on her clipboard. Back to the subject, Alicia asks again what she wanted, and Mariette begins to explain. We see that actually everything that was going to happen was related to the king of the Iron Mountain. And at that moment, Alicia was running among various people. In her head, the girl says that the demon pig sealed in the test units was going to do something. That's why Korin was worried, and that's why she needed to go there. In the test unit, Dina asks Mariette what she thinks differentiates special demons from monsters. The girl answers that it's because they are strong, and Dina replies that she's right, as one of their strongest abilities is the power of domination. Damon, on the other hand, watching all that, seems a bit uncomfortable with Mariette's presence. Dina comments that some demons emit a different energy from regular demons, and theoretically, they are called alpha entities. This alpha entity can easily command its own kind, but this domination ability doesn't work on demons different from themselves. But it was different for special demons, and Mariette responds that for them, it did work. The girl explains that special demons can command any demon weaker than them, and Dina quickly replies that she was correct. Mariette thought about when she fled to the hunting grounds and, driven mad by thirst, controlled the monsters and made them offer their blood to her. However, she reveals to the witch in front of her that her power was different from domination because instead of controlling their minds, she used fear. Dina retorts that this was due to the girl's species, as there were 3 types of demons: monsters, evil spirits, and demi-humans. Mariette, confused, asks if that meant she could control other demi-humans, but Dina replies probably not, since the intellect of that race is high. The teacher decides to end the theoretical conversation and begin the practical one, and she asks them all to bring the boars. At that moment, several scientists begin to walk toward Dana carrying cages containing boars. The teacher says that the objective of that experiment was to see how far the alpha characteristics could go, because if she could control that, humans might be able to control most monsters and spirits, and Mariette tells herself that this was a bigger experiment than she expected. But suddenly, Dina returns to the subject and asks if Mariette managed to make the elixir taste good, and the girl promptly responds that thanks to her, yes. Returning to the important matter, the witch asks if Mariette could try to tame the boars, and the girl agrees. She quickly gives an order to the animals, who stare at Mariette with hatred. All the scientists release the monsters from their cages, and they begin to move toward the vampire. Dunilef issues a command for them to stop, and apparently they obey. Next, the girl continues and decides to give another order to the boars. Mariette immediately commands them to lie down, but for some reason, the monsters begin to roll over, which confuses the girl. The girl asks why this was happening, and Dina replies it's because lower-ranked monsters don't have the intelligence to understand commands. Therefore, she decides to check how different this communication is for beasts of the same species, and then the woman asks Fermac to release the king's seal. The man begins to do as commanded using the banishment rune. He releases the first seal, and with that, the giant boar begins to howl. With that, it begins to control the boars that were previously under Mariette's command. The smaller creatures become filled with fury and begin to charge at the humans. Mariette tries to command them to stop, but doesn't work, so she has to use one of her spells to strike the nearby boar. Dana then asks if they were losing control of the creatures so easily because they were boars. Mariette was about to say something, but before she could, an explosion occurs, and one of the scientists reports that the monster from cage 101 escaped. Upon hearing that absurdity, the witch turns and states that this couldn't be real. Suddenly, we see a snake's tail slithering across the place, and it is revealed that the creature was a manticore, half snake, half lion. Marriott begins to use her vampire abilities, summoning a blood spear. She states that the creature was incredibly fast, but even so, she doesn't give up and attacks the monster. Her attacks were being easily dodged, and the girl becomes annoyed. Fermac asks her to conserve her strength, and then he lands a punch on the monster's face. The professor uses his demolition screw ability to deal even more damage to the creature. Not satisfied, he prepares his other arm and lands another punch on the monster. After doing that, the young man comments to Professor Dina that there was something strange. More screams and noises can be heard, and chaos begins to break out in the place. One of the scientists says something is wrong as the monsters were escaping from their cages and throwing themselves against the bars, but Dina tries to resolve the situation. She concludes that they would lose some research funds, but the priority was safety. Scientists from other groups begin to follow Dana's orders, and one of them reports that the magic circle wasn't activating. Another scientist also reports the same thing was happening with the ceiling magic circle, which was very strange. Then they conclude that someone had destroyed the ceiling magic circle. Suddenly, looking back, the witch teacher sees some chains breaking. The woman immediately realizes what that means, and a look of despair takes over her face. Then it is revealed that the giant creature, the king of the Iron Mountain, had broken free. In the port city of Sar, we see some boats docking. In a bar, some people were talking about trivial matters. Corin thinks that the reason he was enjoying such a grand feast that day was to celebrate his promotion to semi-first ranking. He asks Haman if they should order a bottle of soju, but the old man seems hesitant since he was an instructor and his student was underage. The boy thinks that, like Corin, he was legally still underage, so he had no opportunity to drink, and that strange mix of past and future in that world prevented him from drinking. Moreover, the sadness of not being able to eat chicken together with a nice cold beer was something that deeply bothered him. Therefore, the boy tells his instructor that there is a saying in the East that alcohol is something you need to learn from adults. That way, he declares that he would like his instructor to teach him more about alcohol, because he trusts Haman a lot. Seeing that gentle and admiring look, Haman is touched and says that this definitely wasn't a sign of greed for wanting to drink alcohol. So the man finally gives in and serves soju to Corin, who becomes extremely happy and celebrates that he fooled the old man. However, the boy hears a sound that makes him extremely scared. Haman also hears it and asks if the sound was a dog barking, and Corin asks why this was happening now. In his head, the boy states that this must be his first drink in years, and we see that next to him was the bloodhound. We then return to the moment when Dina realized the boar had broken free. Fermac immediately moves to try to stop the creature and asks Marriott to do something. The girl then begins to use her magic to create a giant ice crystal spear above her head in order to defeat or incapacitate the monster easily. She immediately throws that attack at the creature, which receives the powerful impact directly. However, something happens that leaves Marriott shocked and unable to believe what she is seeing. The young woman immediately realizes that her powerful attack had simply shattered. She also comments that it was strange as that attack wasn't supposed to have caused just that little damage. Nevertheless, Fermac steps in front of the girl, commenting that even so it was a good effort and states that he will finish things. Damon uses his fists to punch his opponent, who doesn't react. Seeing this, Fermac is startled to realize that the king of the Iron Mountain simply didn't feel anything. The professor, while falling back to the ground, questions whether his attack really caused no damage. However, the creature wasn't playing around and begins to use a rune, which frightens the human. The boar strikes the man, who is thrown back without even being able to react. Fermac's back crashes into a wall, causing him significant damage. Dina panics when she realizes that with that impact, the wall was destroyed and the barrier system disabled. At that moment, an emergency signal begins to sound, and all the cages holding creatures begin to crack. All the monsters that were imprisoned and sealed inside the cages are released, and complete chaos begins. A voice begins shouting that the Veronic Code has been activated and that everyone should evacuate the place immediately. The voice also yells that security must mobilize the spiritual golems, and so the creatures are summoned. A fierce battle between the monsters and the golem team begins without us knowing who might come out victorious. One of the golems advances to try to reveal its enemies. However, the venomous dragon, a rank 1 magical beast, advances and eliminates the poor robot. The King Heron, a rank 1 demonic beast, was also attacking and destroying all the robots it could. Those two monsters, joined by other smaller ones, begin advancing against the defense force. Dina, desperate, realizes that if those monsters escaped the academy, everything would collapse, so she authorizes consecutive lightning strikes in the shared area. Because of that, shocks begin to be launched at the monsters. The smaller creatures begin to feel pain, but one of them gets through and charges at the witch teacher. However, suddenly the monster is quickly finished off by 2 swords, which leaves the witch confused. The mysterious being who did that states that his employer's predictions are getting more and more terrifying. Dina realizes that it was drawn and completely confused, asks what he was doing. However, the young man promptly ignores her, advancing and eliminating more of his enemies with his technique. King Heron begins charging a fire attack in his mouth. He quickly fires the flames at Drawn. Suddenly, a fusion of debris begins to appear and a golem emerges. A giant golem made from the pieces of destroyed robots appears to fight against that Paraguayan Godzilla. Upon seeing that he had managed to do what he wanted, Cranel celebrates as the techniques that Guy had taught him really worked. He explains that a few days ago, Corin said that stamina is power, and he forced him to train in the training room before giving him some golem magic techniques. And the price for learning that was being there that day, and at that moment, a battle between giant monsters begins. Cranel's giant golem begins to receive a buff and is surrounded by some tree roots. That way the robot merges with those roots, becoming even more powerful and regenerating from the hit it had taken. We see that the one who did that was Yule, and the girl was also surprised at how Corin knew about that in advance. As it passes through all the opponents, the venomous dragon tries to escape, and Dina warns everyone about it. In the blink of an eye, the monster suffers several injuries caused by Alicia, who appears at the scene. The creature begins to fall toward the ground, and the girl wonders if they had really won. Upon realizing that all the students who showed up were at least rank 2, Dana says that this was excellent. Confused, she asks why those kids were united in that test unit. Then they all mutually answer that it was a technical visit, leaving the teacher even more confused. The narrator states that at that moment, Corin's plan, even though he was not at the academy, was being followed splendidly. The blood realm is activated, and something begins to happen to the giant boar. Marriott manages to trap the king of the Iron Mountain away from the ground following Corin's request. So she begins to attack the creature with several ice strikes and starts to injure the monster. The stakes pierce the poor boar, which can't even react. The scientists, upon seeing that, become extremely frightened, wondering how that was possible. However, while casting her spells, Marriott asks the Mountain King not to underestimate her because she was also a special one. King Heron, who instead of a demonic beast was a first-rank monster that looked like Godzilla, was furious. He begins to roar and shoot attacks in several directions, and Dron realizes that just that creature moving was enough to make everything collapse. Cranel, controlling his golem, asks Yule to give him more support, and the girl does what was asked. The golem scraps with the help of Yule's druidic magic, and the golem techniques that Cornlock provided made the creation of that powerful robot possible. At that moment, the creature lands a direct punch on the monster, which seems to feel the hit. However, Godzilla isn't very happy and retaliates, preparing to scratch the golem. Cranel asks Yule to restore the skin on the fists, as their plan was to explode all 5 absorbed bombs to spread a large amount of mana. The narrator explains that Druid Yule and Golem Master Cranel were a very popular duo among players for dealing with large monsters. At that moment, a massive buff is applied to the arm of the giant golem. So Cranel makes a huge scene to give a command to his creation, leaving Yule irritated. But when he presses a button, the monster lands a powerful punch to King Heron's face. Celebrating as if he were in an anime, Cranel says that was really cool, but Yule keeps looking at him with a face full of contempt. Corin begins to explain that Sar is a port city a few kilometers from the test unit. He specifically chose the haunted house to go there. At that moment, we see that Marriott's dog was already crying, and Corin was saying he had something to do while knocking on the door of a church. Corin tells the nun that he was a student from the academy sent from abroad and that he couldn't attend mass, and asks if he could use their prayer room, and the woman agrees. Then, after entering, the boy thinks that if his memories were correct, that was the signaler. Due to the situation, he hoped that person could come as quickly as possible. Then, as he turns around, Corin says her response was as quick as he expected. Josephine, while pointing a sword at our protagonist, asks the boy how he knew about that signaler and says he better give a good answer. In his head, the boy says she must have a lot of questions, but now wasn't the time. So he says that first they needed to deal with some urgent matters. Back at the battle between the giant monsters, the robot had just punched Godzilla. While watching that battle, Alicia comments that she had never seen anything like it in her life. But before the girl could think about it, the venomous dragon recovered from her cuts and charged to attack her. Facing that giant beast, the girl says she didn't want to fight it alone. In her mind, she remembers Marriott explaining the instructions Corin had given. That instruction was that she couldn't use domain rupture under any circumstances, and while dodging one of the beast's attacks, the girl becomes furious about it. She tells herself that Corin must have said that because he saw some potential in her, and in her mind she questions whether she could really do it. Suddenly, a thunderous sound can be heard, which leaves Alicia confused. The blood orb begins to take some impacts, and a noise inside it can be heard. The cage made by Marriott begins to crack and is then destroyed, leaving the vampire startled. She is thrown back, falling to the ground right after, badly injured and incapacitated. Lying on the ground and defeated, the girl reports that it really was just as Corin had said. In her memories, she thinks that Corin had said she probably wouldn't be able to defeat the demon pig. Our protagonist explains that it turned into a demon pig after consuming the oldest steel and for possessing the original rune. It had 100% resistance to physical and magical attacks. The narrator also informs us that this is the reason why countless heroes were killed and unable to defeat it, and the only solution was to seal it. Even so, Marriott doesn't give up since Corin had asked her to do this. So with several blood blades around her, she charges once more against that powerful enemy she didn't even know could be defeated. Distracted, Alicia sees Marriott's determination, and at that moment, the dragon charges at her once more. However, the girl was aware of it, and while telling herself that she had no choice but to succeed too, she is surrounded by an aura. The narrator declares that the professor from the magic college, Dina, could do nothing but sigh at the sight before her. At that moment, Marriott uses a snow blossom alchemy spell on her opponent, launching multiple attacks against him. Thus, the battle between the legendary great demonic being, King of the Iron Mountain, and the elder rank vampire, Marriott Dillenef, continues intensely. Although Marriott was suffering, she was definitely managing to fight the demon pig, and the conflict was only possible because she was a special being. That's why Professor Dina realized she was witnessing a moment that would one day be marked in history, and she couldn't hide her admiration. The enraged pig rushes toward his opponent. Marriott tries to slash him by launching several ice stakes, but they were just thorns in his path. As a last resort, the vampire tries to use the multiple blood shield, but even that wasn't enough, and the Mountain King breaks through the defense. The students had worked hard to prevent the demonic beasts from leaving the test unit, but everyone realized that defeat was approaching. At that moment, the pig apparently manages to strike his opponent, who had been giving him so much trouble. However, upon looking at the wall he had hit, he realizes that Marriott wasn't there. This creates confusion in the boar, who looks around for his prey. We then see that Diako had saved his master. She is confused to see her animal, but Marriott realizes that it meant that person was there. Alicia also wasn't doing well, and at that moment, the serpent dragon hits the girl. The young woman comments that not being able to use domain rupture greatly reduced her range of abilities to defeat that creature, and she wonders what Corin would do in this situation. At that moment, the dragon turns, charging once again toward the swordswoman. Arden declares that if it were Corin, he wouldn't have another choice, so she leaps, going along the beast's back. She uses the basic notions, dodge and slash, and clears her mind to empty it. With that idea in mind, she manages to slash and tear the monster apart. The creature once again crashes to the ground, heavily wounded by those multiple blows. Alicia wonders what that was, but upon realizing she had managed to defeat her enemy, she celebrates because she did it without using domain rupture. Suddenly, someone congratulates the girl, saying she really did a good job. Corin tells his companions that they all did well. Cranel was also celebrating inside his golem for having defeated that monster. The boy was euphoric, saying he didn't need Corin or any friends. He only needed his warrior Ludin, and the elf becomes even more irritated with that idiot. Our protagonist begins to analyze the entire situation alongside Josephine, and he asks Alicia where the demon pig was. The girl explains that Marriott was holding him back well, but she needed help. Josephine asks what the plan is now, since by bringing her there from the church, Corin must already be thinking of something, and the boy replies that yes. He states that he just needed help to capture the demon pig, but there were many other monsters besides that creature there. The narrator informs that there was something in his plan that he made Marriott do, which was to feed the monsters in the test unit with stones engraved with rune magic. After feeding the monsters many stones engraved with runes, the plan was to wipe them out using the rune resonance activation function. At that moment, all the monsters begin to burn from the inside out. Corin states that the activation of resonance with the silver spear made of rune stone was only possible because of time and his tenacity. He calls Alicia to run by his side, and thus the two begin to advance in a direction. It is explained that among the min or high-level monsters that survived the resonance activation, about 30 remained standing, including the demon pig. Corin, while running, comments that there was no need to worry. He asks Dron to join them, and the young man finally realizes that his master had arrived. Locke also asks Cranel to help them, but the boy starts saying he didn't meet him, and Yule scolds the orange-haired boy. Thus, all the names from the game Legendary Hero of Arhen were gathered, and those were the heroes who would soon save the world in the future. Upon arriving near Marriott, the boy asks if his colleague is okay, and she replies that she is. So now, united with all his companions, they decide to begin a counterattack against that creature.